The London Assembly is the voice of London, elected at the same time as the Mayor to hold him to account. The Mayor has a statutory duty to answer questions from Assembly members. I remind members that in accordance with safety guidelines, face masks must be worn at all times in the chamber unless speaking or unless you are medically exempt. Can I ask the clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm any apologies for absence?
I can confirm there are no apologies for absence, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with an update on recent Assembly activity. During the year ahead, the London Assembly will continue to hold the Mayor to account on issues that matter most to Londoners. As our city rebuilds from COVID-19, Londoners will need strong voices representing them from every corner of our city. Our role is to ensure that London continues to be a great place to live and work. Before the pre-election period, the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee wrote to the Mayor with recommendations on how he can help those living in unsafe and overcrowded homes due to cladding. As part of this work, the committee spoke with a number of homeowners in London who are facing thousands of pounds worth of bills to remove unsafe cladding from their buildings. Our work programmes are currently in discussion and will be finalised soon, but it's important in the coming year that as an Assembly we work together across political divides to achieve what Londoners have asked us to prioritise. Our strength is our differences. As we look ahead to London's recovery, we commit to working on behalf of Londoners and with the Mayor to make our city a better place for all. Let's get on with that task at hand. On item 2, can I ask the Assembly to note the interests set out at item 2 with the addition of Assembly Member McCartney's declaration as Deputy Mayor, and congratulations for that. Do Assembly members have any other disclosable pecuniary interests which relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting, or any other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality? Your silence is a no, so we'll carry on. Item 6. I brought this item forward a little because there is an urgent item that I think we need to resolve now. Understanding Order 2.2, I would like to briefly take item 6 on the agenda before we proceed to the Mayor's report. I have agreed to accept an item of urgent business at this meeting in accordance with section 100B4 of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, as detailed in the supplementary agenda circulated earlier this morning. Item 6A concerns the appointment of Assembly Member Marina Ahmad as a member of the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee following the nomination of the London Assembly Labour Group. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the recommendation as set out in the report? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 3, we now move on to the Mayor's report. Can I ask the Assembly formally to receive the Mayor's report covering the period from the 5th of March 2021 to the 13th of May 2021? The Mayor will now provide, sir, an oral update of up to 5 minutes in length on matters occurring since the publication of this report.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here in person. It's great to see you all and to have the opportunity to welcome some new faces to City Hall. I want to begin by congratulating you all on your election wins. It's fantastic to see a London Assembly that reflects our city's incredible diversity, and I look forward to working with every one of you. I also want to congratulate new Chair Andrew Boff on his appointment. We may have our political differences, but we both share a passion for public service and our amazing city. And it was lovely to see you, Chair, at the opening of the London Blossom Garden earlier on this week. I want to start by providing an update on COVID-19. A targeted surge testing is taking place in 5 of our boroughs: Hillingdon, Harrow, Brent, Ealing and Hounslow, in order to identify cases of the variant first discovered in India and to stop it spreading further. This development shows we're not out of the woods yet. I remain in constant contact with NHS London, Public Health England, local health officials and council leaders, as well as our government. And together, we'll continue to take whatever steps are necessary to protect the health of Londoners. I'd urge everyone in our city to continue following the rules, get regularly tested, and to get vaccinated as soon as you're able to. At the same time, we must be mindful of the huge economic challenges this pandemic is continuing to pose. That's why my first act after being re-elected was to launch our Let's Do London campaign to encourage Londoners and visitors from around the UK back into the heart of our capital to safely support our world-famous venues and businesses. I hope this campaign will attract cross-party backing and is one that all members can get behind. I am truly humbled that Londoners have re-elected me as their mayor. The election result gives my administration an overwhelming mandate to pursue our vision of a fairer, greener, safer and more prosperous city. I've stressed my commitment to building bridges with government in order to work in the best interests of Londoners. And I hope we get a deal for TfL in the coming days that shows the government is willing to work constructively with us. Because we must all work together to build a better and brighter future for London after the pandemic. This is as true for addressing air pollution as it is for building affordable homes and tackling violent crime. And on the latter, I'm pleased to be announcing today extra funding for a vital programme that helps young Londoners to exit gangs. This follows a hugely successful week-long county lines operation by the Met Police, resulting in 190 arrests, multiple guns, knives and other dangerous weapons being taken off our streets, and the rescue of 240 children and vulnerable adults who are being exploited into drug trafficking. Nothing could be more important than protecting our communities, supporting our young people and securing our economic recovery, because I want everyone in our city to be able to fulfil their potential. That was my ambition for all Londoners when I first stood to be mayor, and I remain as passionate as ever about delivering it. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Devenish.
Chair. Good morning, Mr Mayor, and congratulations on your re-election. I'd like to fully support your call to build bridges with our government. AM Rogers and I met with government last night on Hammersmith Bridge. It is clear that the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham needs all our help to reopen the bridge ASAP. Will you please ask the Deputy Mayor to redouble efforts to help the London Borough with government to reopen the bridge as soon as possible, please?
Thanks for your question. I know how inconvenient it's been, that's me being polite, to your constituents and many on both sides of the river. And also thanks for the way you raised the issue. I think it's really important for ourselves, for the councils and the government to work together, because in the meantime, local businesses, local residents are suffering hugely, and I can give that commitment to not just for the Deputy Mayor, but myself to redouble our efforts to get this bridge at the very least reopened for pedestrians and cyclists, and then eventually for vehicles as well.
Thank you. We now move to the questions on the... Oh, I keep forgetting this. We now move to the questions on the priority order paper. The first question is question number 2021/1947, Violence in London, in the name of Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your question. I know I speak for all Londoners when I say our hearts go out to Daniel's family. I'm angry and deeply saddened that young Londoners like Daniel lose their lives to senseless acts of violence, and I'm determined to do everything I can to ensure no family has to experience the horror of a loved one being injured or killed in a violent crime. That's why I've already invested a record £1 billion in tackling crime and the causes of crime, and why I introduced a public health approach to the issue in London. This year alone, I've invested £12.85 million into our violence reduction unit, And in March, I invested a further £8 million of council tax funding in violence prevention projects, alongside £30 million in additional funding from City Hall to the Met Police Service to protect frontline officer numbers in Havering and across London. This includes more funding for youth workers to support young victims of violence presenting at London's major trauma centres and A&Es. 10 young Havering residents were seen by this service in 2021 and 2020, and it includes investment in tackling the criminal exploitation of children and young people by county lines gangs. In 2020-2021, 145 young Londoners were supported by the Rescue and Response Service, 24 of whom were from Havering. I can't stress enough how important these interventions are and how truly grateful I am to the people working day in, day out to support them. I also welcome the arrival of additional government funding to boost our efforts, with £8 million allocated to London in March. The Home Office are quite prescriptive about what the funding can be used for. The Met Police Service is allocating some of this money specifically to surge activity to suppress violence as lockdown eases, targeting the most dangerous offenders. The rest will be invested in tailored policing approaches that use a range of data to identify and resource the primary violence hotspots in each basic command unit. I'm absolutely committed to driving down violent crime in Havering and throughout London. We can make a bigger difference by working together, and I look forward to working with you, Senator Prince, and the rest of the Assembly with our shared ambition of a safer city for all Londoners.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm very pleased that you're keen to work together. As you know, I'm always happy to be collegiate. With that in mind, will you then agree, Mr Mayor, to meet with myself and some mums of victims of these heinous crimes who've actually lost their son, so that we can sit down with you and that you can learn from them to help you structure your plans?
I regularly meet with bereaved families, including mums, dads, carers, siblings, and so forth. And I'm always happy to meet more families, either through you or others as well. So we can all arrange a time. It's very important.
Can I also be cheeky, Mr Mayor, because I know that you, like me, are passionate about trying to get people out of homelessness. You probably are aware of Hills Foundation, who are giving away 200 free units across the South East. I've got one of the units coming down to Westminster on the 28th of June. I'm going to send you a formal invitation to come and have a look. I hope you'll be able to make that.
Yeah, it's not cheeky at all. More than happy to if I can. And can I just, for those that don't know, Senator Prince is a good example of us putting aside differences in part political terms and working closely together on a range of issues. I'm more than happy to come down.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Duval.
I don't think the Assembly member was being cheeky, but I think it's important for new members to realise that if you ask a core question, you're meant to stick to the core question or substance around it. I think if we mean to go on and stick to our rules, it would. I mean, I understand why the member raised it and why the Mayor answered in the way that he did, but it was very different from the core question around violence.
I'll take that on board, Assembly Member Duval.
I accept that, Assembly.
That's a good reminder.
It in that way, but I think we just need to do good practice for the future.
Yeah. Well, they were getting on so nicely, I didn't want to interrupt. Yes. Assembly members are reminded of that. Thank you very much. Can I now move to the next question, 1484, concerning delivering London's transport strategy, Mr Mayor?
It's a bit difficult. My transport strategy remains the right long-term approach to developing the transport network in London over the next 2 decades. It has the support of Londoners, and it's now more important than ever that we work to achieve its aim. The pandemic has only served to highlight the importance of helping Londoners to travel healthily, sustainably and efficiently on foot, bicycle and using public transport. It has also brought into sharper focus the need to tackle the unacceptable levels of vehicle emissions and congestion caused by having too many cars on the road. That's why I'm determined to press ahead with implementing my transport strategy, including through the London Recovery Programme and by fulfilling the commitments I made in my manifesto. I'm excited about what we can achieve over the next 3 years. This includes improvements to streets to enable more journeys and better access to our high streets by foot, bike and bus, and major rail improvements that will open to passengers this year and next, like the Elizabeth Line, the Northern Line extension and the Barking Riverside extension to the overground network. However, it's clear that proper financial support from the government for TfL will be absolutely vital to achieving these aims and to supporting London and the UK's wider economic recovery. TfL's financial sustainability plan shows the need not only for immediate COVID-related financial support, but also for government investment each year beyond 2023. This is essential for TfL to continue to operate a world-class public transport system, help to reduce carbon emissions, improve air quality, tackle obesity, improve accessibility, build new homes and support the capital's economy. That's why I'm working so hard to make the case to the government that sustainable long-term funding for TfL will be money well spent. On the 18th of May, it was agreed to extend TfL's previous funding agreement to tomorrow, 28th of May, to allow for discussions to conclude.
Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. And first of all, congratulations on being re-elected. I voted for you, second preference, and I know that contributed in the final round, and I look forward to discussing some of the ideas from my manifesto with you so that you can make some use of them. Now, today I was planning to discuss the terms of the expected New Deal for Transport for London, particularly walking and cycling funding, but obviously you don't have a deal yet. So instead, I would like to ask about other sources of revenue and what's been said about them before, what our options are. Now, in January, Transport for London sent to government its financial sustainability plan on time. But on Friday, at the TfL Programmes and Investment Committee, the Commissioner said the government had provided no response to it, just an acknowledgement of receipt. So can I just check, can I just confirm that is still the case today?
Well, firstly, apologies to the other two parties, but I also gave my second preference to you, Sean, and to the Greens, so it's, which explains your tally for so many second preferences. But can I just say, so far we've received no formal response or any response to the plan we submitted by the deadline. Yeah.
That really worries me. I mean, we've got an extension until tomorrow, but we still have no response, and you can't tell me any more about that, presumably. So I'll move on to my next question. In the financial sustainability plan, a boundary charge was suggested as an interim step. Now, I think, given discussions that have taken place over recent months, we kind of all agree that a single day-long charge for coming into London from outside is a bit of a blunt instrument, and it certainly looks like the government doesn't support a boundary charge either. But if nobody wants a charge like that, then it's government who needs to tide us over until we can develop something fairer. Don't you agree? And have the government conceded that in your discussions so far?
I think it's probably not sensible, Chair, to give a running commentary on negotiations with the government, but it's a big issue because you've either got to massively reduce expenditure or find other ways to raise revenues. I similarly think extending the congestion charge to the North Circle and South Circle is not on either. So it's navigating our way through the short-term financial challenges because we're not going to get to pre-pandemic levels for some time. Just to give you an idea where we are, the tube numbers yesterday were about 40% of what they were pre-pandemic. Bus numbers around 61%. So there's a big gap between what we need to run TfL. I'm going to keep running a full service because otherwise people won't come back, and so it is a challenge.
Okay, and then finally, your trips to the north have been really interesting to see. Are you lobbying for a package deal of similar medium-term arrangements for London and other cities as a kind of combination with other mayors? Because it does look a bit like that, what you're doing.
One of the interesting things is what a sort of hodgepodge arrangement there is between different regions and central government. We're hoping the CSR provides an opportunity to put us all in the same place. And one of the things we did this week is, there's 10 of us now, Metro mayors across the country, get together to discuss what we'll be doing together. That includes, inverted commas, levelling up. It includes recovery. It includes zero carbon, but also includes conversations around the CSR and what bids we put in as a group, as well as what we put in as individual mayors.
Excellent, thank you very much. I very much support that. It's an approach I've been asking for a while, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Assembly Member Berry. The next question is 1781, delivering manifesto commitments and the GLA budget. Assembly Member Duval's question.
Thank you, Chair. As I said in my opening statement, I'm deeply humbled by the trust that's been placed in me to continue leading the greatest city on earth. There is nothing I take more seriously than my commitment to Londoners, and I've been determined to deliver for them from day one of this second term, just like when I was first elected 5 years ago. In my second term as Mayor, I promised to stand up for London during these tough times and to deliver the changes our city needs. This means getting London's economy firing on all cylinders again, protecting and creating the high-quality jobs Londoners deserve, and banging the drum for our city, both at home and around the world, to attract the jobs, business and investment we need. Our recovery from this pandemic is too important to let politics get in the way. So I'm reaching out to the government so that we can work constructively together for the sake of London and the whole country. London is the engine of the UK's economy, and we stand ready to play our part in a national recovery that benefits everyone. Rather than pitting parts of our country against one another, let's level up London and every other town, city and region in the UK. I also promise to continue working day and night to tackle the long-standing issues that matters most to Londoners, tackling violence, making London safer, building more affordable homes, supporting young Londoners, and tackling the twin challenges of air pollution and climate change. In everything I do as a Mayor, you'll see my commitment to creating a fairer, more equal and more just city for all Londoners. These are the challenges ahead as we work to get the city back on its feet, but I'm confident that we can harness the spirit that got us through the pandemic to reopen, rebuild and reignite our amazing city, putting the dark days of the past year behind us.
It's in that spirit of reaching out to government. Can I just highlight one particular scheme, the Kickstart scheme, aimed at 18 to 24-year-olds? Now, of course, this is a very important scheme, and the government is right to prioritise that. But there's problems with it. There's problems with the government reaching its targets, but all the private sector people that I talk to in my constituency are saying it's not working for them. Will you use your office and the influence of bringing the partners of London together to speak to government, to see if there are some changes and tweaks to the scheme that can benefit everyone and make it easier and more accessible for those that need that support to employ others? Immediately, we've got some time here. It looks like the economy, I think your recent release says where it's going at the moment. It's using this time properly to get schemes like this to work properly for not just London, but for the country.
Yeah, spot on. I think the Kickstart scheme is a good scheme. The theory is great. It's one we had similarly in 2008, 9, 10. But it has a mixed response. And what I hope the government will do is to be flexible enough to adapt it to make sure it meets the aspirations of businesses. Businesses want to invest in young people. They want to play their role, but it's not quite working as government intended. And so we're happy to work with them. We've got a huge amount of expertise. We also speak to many businesses, small, medium and large, who could really add input to this. The other part of the equation is the apprenticeship levy, not quite working as the government intended. Again, great idea, and we think we can help. And I think we are reaching out to government, and I think the government is hopefully more receptive now there's no elections forthcoming, and we can sort of park party politics and work together.
Thank you. Just, do you want to comment on what the economic situation looks like over the 3-year period of this? Because
Yeah.
I think government are indicating that it's probably at the end of 2 to 3 years where we might come under pressure.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean, in that sense?
And there's
Do
a number
you
of-
concur with that?
I mean, apparently it's unwise to listen to forecasts from economists. History tells us sometimes they get it wrong. I think the forecast we've got so far is optimistic for a rapid recovery in the next couple of years. The two big concerns is one is when the furlough scheme ends in September, particularly for some sectors that rely upon footfall, non-essential retail, culture, hospitality, leisure and tourism. And secondly, what happens in the medium to long term, because we still haven't seen the consequences of Brexit for professional services. It's no deal basically, and we are nervous about that. We're a global city who relies upon international travel, and so this year we think will be better than we expected. The real concern is 2023 and 2024.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. The next question is question number 1400 on building safety on public land from Assembly Member Bakari.
Chair, can I congratulate Hina on your election for the first time? I see Mum is in the Assembly. It's nice to see her. I know she's very proud, and I knew your dad very well. He'd be really proud, and congratulations. The building safety crisis is one of the most pressing challenges facing our country, and I'm strongly committed to protecting Londoners affected by this. I've stood with the survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire, and I've seen the impact of the crisis firsthand. Recent fires, most notably at New Providence Wharf, remind us that nearly 4 years after Grenfell, too many people are still living in unsafe homes, and that we must not rest until everyone is safe. I want to support Londoners on this issue in 3 important ways. First, I'm doing everything within my powers to ensure buildings are as safe as possible. To this end, I've ensured new buildings in London need to meet tough fire safety standards by introducing for the first time new measures in the London Plan. I've also set new requirements in the Affordable Homes Programme, as well as for development on GLA land and any projects procured on GLA land. Second, I'm using my convening powers to coordinate the sector and its response to the building safety crisis. For example, I've convened a task and finish group to improve the EWS1 form process, where leaseholders request forms for lenders certifying that the external walls of their homes are not made from combustible materials. The group will support social sector landlords to follow best practice and improve the experience of residents who have struggled to secure EWS1 forms, leaving them unable to sell their homes and move on with their lives. And finally, I'll continue to advocate for Londoners and engage with the government on the need for more funding to remediate unsafe buildings. As I've said repeatedly, leaseholders should not be charged to put right historic building safety defects that were not their fault, regardless of the height of their building or the type of safety defect. I'm pleased the government now accepts the principle of a developer levy, something I proposed back in December. I'm committed to working closely with the government on this and more broadly to finding long-term, meaningful solutions that will keep Londoners safe in their homes.
Thank you for your answer and your very kind welcome, Mr Mayor. I think we need to agree that the government response is far from perfect on the cladding crisis, but you can do more as the Mayor of London. I recently met residents living in the former athletes' village of the Olympic Park. 63 of those buildings are potential fire traps. Innocent leaseholders are stuck in unsafe buildings, facing eye-watering bills. Now, these buildings were contracted and built with public money and on public land. What will you personally do to make them safe and without pushing costs onto leaseholders?
Well, firstly, many of the leaseholders that you talk about have unimaginable strain on them, and I've met many leaseholders over the last period. You'll be aware from the conversations you've had that these blocks in East Village are owned and managed by Delancey, Get Living and Triathlon Homes. We speak regularly, my Deputy Mayor for Housing, Tom Copley, and the team at City Hall speak regularly with building owners and managers to accelerate remediation. Small amounts of ACM cladding within the external wall system have been identified in 11 of the 66 developments in the development, and we continue to use our planning powers also to speak with Delancey and Get Living, including on the issue of fire safety.
Now, many of these leaseholders that you've mentioned only own a share of their homes, but face 100% of the fire safety costs. Many just really want to sell back their share to the housing association so they can move on. Will you give shared owners in the Olympic Park and across London a way out by supporting the buyback scheme?
Well, the issue is for the government to provide the financial support that the residents need. We've not got the resources to provide the residents with the support they need, but a number of these residents feel like their properties are albatrosses around their necks. For the reasons you know, not just EWS1, but for other reasons, they can't sell them. They're worried they're unsafe. And we've asked the government to support them financially and then later on work with the developers, the owners, the managers to get the money back for the government. The only people who can afford to support the residents is the government, and I think there's cross-party agreement on the Assembly for us to lobby the government to do more.
Excellent. And finally, over 2 months ago, several buildings applied for the Waking Watch Relief Fund, which is administered by the GLA and under the Mayor of London, but have heard nothing back. Now, this is unacceptable. Will you take responsibility and speed up the Waking Watch Relief Fund process right away?
I mean, all the rules that we use are rules from MHCLG. We administer the funds from MHCLG. If there's any particular issues with delay, of course, we're happy to look into that. But it's worth just reminding you and colleagues that the rules aren't written by us. We, if you like, are just the middle third party, making sure the money's facilitated. More than happy, though, to look into any individual cases. Chair, I'm sure that new members will be explained how to reach my office to make sure we can expedite anything we can do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answer.
Pleasure. Well, good luck.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is 1541, TfL's Extraordinary Funding and Financing Agreement, and it's from Assembly Member Baker.
Can I also congratulate you on your election and enjoy the next 3 years plus on the Assembly, I hope. London's economy represents 23% of the country's GDP, and investment in transport here supports jobs and growth across the UK, including 43,000 jobs nationwide through the Tube Investment Programme alone. London has to be at the heart of the UK's post-pandemic economic recovery, and there will be no recovery for London without a properly funded TfL. The pandemic has decimated TfL's finances. It's shown that TfL can no longer be forced to rely so heavily on fares revenue. Sustainable funding is needed if we're going to have a transport system that continues to be safe, reliable and capable of supporting the things that are essential post-pandemic: jobs, homes and economic growth. This month I launched my Let's Do London campaign, encouraging people from across the country to make the most of our amazing capital city this summer. The boost this will provide to the national recovery will be huge. But again, we need a properly funded transport network to make this happen. The current series of short-term funding arrangements does not serve that purpose. It prevents TfL from operating effectively and efficiently and puts at risk the resources we need to avoid a car-led recovery, which would replace one health crisis with another. Put simply, without proper long-term funding, we can't move forward and the national recovery may stall. That's not a risk that we can afford to take, so I'm asking the government to fund TfL properly, sustainably and for the long term, so that we can invest back into London's transport network. On the 8th of May, as I said, it was agreed to extend TfL's previous funding agreement to tomorrow, 28th of May, to allow for discussions to conclude. These discussions are still underway. I'm not able to provide a running commentary at this moment, as I don't want to prejudice any outcomes, but I will ensure members are briefed and London is informed about the details of an agreement at the earliest possible opportunity.
Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks for your congratulations. It's good to be here. So just to, we've talked about how we got here, but just to revisit it, on the 23rd of March 2020, the government asked people to stay at home. Londoners did what was required, and we saw a 97% drop in tube use and an 86% drop in bus use. The number of people travelling on public transport is still way below normal, as you referred to in your oral update, which has led to a drastic reduction in fares income and a need for government support. Do you share my anger that the government described this support as a bailout when it is no such thing?
Absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of definitions. Some people even wrongly say TfL is bankrupt and attribute that to us saving the average household £200 by the fares freeze. I think it's important to realise that every transport authority in the world has needed support from their government. We've had more strings attached than any other transport authority. But I think the key thing is to look forward about TfL being sustainable in the medium to long term as well as the short term. The reality is we can't have a situation where our transport system, 72% is contingent upon fares. That's more than any other comparable city in the world. And that's one of the things we are discussing with the DfT going forward.
Thanks very much.
Carry on.
Sorry.
Please carry on.
So yes, just to revisit that a little bit on the long-term funding. In June 2013, the Conservative Liberal Democrat government handed the previous Conservative mayor a long-term 6-year funding deal. Why is it proving so difficult to get the current Conservative government to commit to a long-term sustainable funding arrangement for TfL?
That is the, some would say, £3 billion question. I think the key thing is that for us to get a deal from the government that doesn't put at jeopardy not simply operating TfL but capital issues, we simply can't procure, for example, the Piccadilly line signalling we'd want. We can't make the orders for the electric buses, the hydrogen-powered buses that we want, and our ability to negotiate good deals is affected by not having long-term funding from the government. I think the government does realise, I'm not giving them any secrets, that in the short term it's simply not possible for us to provide services with even 40% on the tube, 61% on the buses. You're right, last year we had as few passengers as any time in the last 100 plus years because London did the right thing. And so we hope the government realises that we do need a long-term deal. The Commissioner's been quite clear. His experience running transport in New York, in cities in Canada and Australia, you can't run them effectively without long-term deals, and I'm hoping the government listens.
Thanks very much for that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is question 1919 on the Edmonton incinerator. Assembly Member Best.
Can I also congratulate you on your election to the Assembly for the first time? I hope you enjoy it. I've been clear that London is facing a climate emergency, and I'll continue to oppose new incineration capacity in London, which is not needed to manage the city's non-recyclable waste. My focus continues to be on increasing recycling services and rates across London. Where incinerators already exist, they should operate at the highest standards and capture energy from waste to heat local houses. In November 2019, there was an unsuccessful attempt to seek a judicial review of the Secretary of State's decision to make the development consent order for the Edmonton incinerator scheme. I have no power to pause the scheme or bring any further legal challenge to this decision. Given this, I'm now focused on making sure that this facility and London's other incinerators minimise their local and social impact. This includes ensuring that they only manage truly non-recyclable waste, they maximise electricity generation, they capture and use the waste heat created during the process, and they operate within the best available techniques to reduce air pollution emissions. To support this, my Green New Deal has provided additional funding to support Enfield and Energetic in developing the low-carbon heat network that will capture waste heat from the Edmonton facility. This will allow the network to be supersized so that it can make at least an additional 20 megawatts of heat available for supply to the boroughs of Haringey and Hackney, while supplying affordable near-zero carbon heat to homes and businesses in Enfield too. I'm committed to London becoming a net zero carbon by 2030 and increasing recycling, especially of food waste. I think this is essential. That's why I'm offering to work with the government to ensure their planned funding to support more London boroughs to provide food waste collections comes forward as quickly as possible.
Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for congratulations. Unlike Assembly Member Berry, I can't promise I gave you my second preference, but congratulations.
Thanks for your honesty, appreciate
that. I can assure you on the Edmonton incinerator, the fight is not over. It's not over for campaigners, it's not over for cross-party MPs working on this, it's not over for NHS doctors writing openly about their opposition, it's not open for the British Heart Foundation writing openly about theirs. And it appears it's not open in your office, who suggested that the modelling for the Edmonton incinerator did not support the capacity that's being built. So I would ask you to join that fight. So would you commit to meeting with campaigners who are currently working for a pause and rethink of the Edmonton incinerator?
Chair, it's really important that we're clear about who's responsible for giving permission and for continuing with the incinerator. It's the government. And I'm always happy to work with particularly members of the Assembly who are from the same party as the government, because they clearly have access that many others don't have. So if you have any influence over the government, over the Secretary of State, over ministers responsible for this decision, including a U-turn, then we're more than happy to work with you. The reality is we've explored all legal avenues open to us, including legal challenges. And as I said in my answer, there aren't any left to us, but if there's any ideas you've got that the government will accede to, we're more than happy, Chair, through you, to work with members of the Assembly.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And just to confirm, will you give a yes or no answer to meeting with campaigners? The fight, as I say, is really not over on this, and as you just acknowledged, I was elected to the Assembly and not to Parliament. However, MPs are still working to lobby government on this. So you, as one of the most powerful politicians in the country and in London, will you join that fight and will you commit to meeting with campaigners?
I'm more than happy to meet the campaigners, but you need to understand I'll be honest with them about who's responsible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Best. The next question is 2017, the London Cancer Hub in Sutton. Assembly Member asked by Assembly Member Garrett.
Can I also congratulate you on your election. You have big shoes to fill. Steve was a really good champion of that part of London, and I hope you enjoy as much as Steve did over the many, many years. In London, around 14,000 people die every year from cancer, and you could fill Wembley Stadium twice with the number of Londoners living with cancer. Many of us know someone who has had or has cancer. This is a health issue that will affect so many of us across our lifetimes, and one important way of tackling it is through the cutting-edge research happening at places like the London Cancer Hub in Sutton. What's more, the life sciences sector is crucial to London's economy, and life sciences clusters like the London Cancer Hub have an important role to play in supporting London's economic recovery from this pandemic. The Institute of Cancer Research and the Royal Marsden are globally renowned for their pioneering work in cancer and rank in the top 4 centres for cancer research and treatment worldwide. Much of this work takes place on the London Cancer Hub site in Sutton. In my first term, I officially opened the state-of-the-art facilities there, which house precision radiotherapy technologies that can target tumours in real time, delivering radiation more accurately and reducing side effects. As in so many areas of our lives, the pandemic has had a terrible impact on cancer diagnosis and care. So I welcome the government's ambition to make the United Kingdom a life science superpower. Combating COVID, cancer and other diseases unites us, not just across the UK but globally. London is a vital part of that effort. As a key partner in the project, I'll continue to work with the London Borough of Sutton, the Institute of Council Research and others like Senator Garrett to help realise this world-class project which can attract the best scientists to expand and develop world-leading council research. The Cancer Hub will play an integral part in London's recovery, benefiting the Borough of Sutton as well as supporting London's and the UK's position as a world-renowned place of life science excellence. I look forward to continuing our collaboration and supporting the ambitions of this project.
Assembly Member Garrett.
You've acknowledged, Mr. Mayor, some of the work going on there. I mean, just so you're aware, I mean, the London Cancer Hub has an amazing potential, some of which you've just set out for life sciences. And the site already has the Royal Marsden Cancer Hospital there and the Institute for Cancer Research, plus actually a new acute care hospital, which we're hoping will be coming along in the near future. And in fact, the ICR discovers more new cancer drugs than any other academic centre in the world. The work they do is quite amazing. But they are having to turn down opportunities for work and collaboration with industry because of the constraints of the site that they're on. And it's the London Cancer Hub plan that really unlocks that potential. And obviously potential for new jobs as well as obviously life-changing cancer treatments. My question really is about the one fly in the ointment of that site, which is its poor transport links. And so what I would ask is whether you would commit to meet with me and TfL and other stakeholders on site to see the potential that's there, to understand the transport constraints that are potentially holding it back, and to really come up with a plan that can make that site thrive.
Chair, there's not anything that the members said that I probably disagree with. And I have met on many occasions, not just those on the Cancer Hub site, but also the council, who are really keen also to improve transport links. There's the short, medium and long term, the issue of obviously Sutton Station, Belmont Station, which only has I think 2 trains an hour, if I'm right, and the bus issues and stuff. And so we think in the short term, we're consulting on, I think it's the bus 80 and the bus S1. We think if the government wants to give us devolution of commuter trains, we could have a metroised system of Southern services. We think we could do a better job, TfL and Southern. But in short, more than happy to meet with you and others in the area. But I don't want to give false expectation. We have put aside a significant amount of money to have a new tram, as indeed have the councils, but there's a shortfall. And we've not yet negotiated a deal with the government around TfL's current finances. So I don't want to give false hope, but I think it's really important for us to work together, because I think all of us agree that Cancer Hub is world leading, and we want to remove any obstacles in it fulfilling its potential.
Thank you. I look forward to that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Garrett. The next question is question 1743 on violence reduction, asked by Assembly Member Desai.
The recent violent killings are hugely concerning, and my thoughts and prayers remain with those affected families. The Met Police Commissioner and I have been clear that we're absolutely determined to drive down violent crime across our city. We're both concerned that we could see an increase in violence this summer as lockdown measures continue to be eased. I'm working with the Met Police Service to prevent violence in our communities, and our Violence Reduction Unit is creating an extensive portfolio of preventative support for those young people most at risk. Many forms of crime were reducing before the pandemic and have continued to reduce. But I'm not complacent. Our focus now is on sustaining the reduction we have seen as a result of the lockdown. During lockdown, the Met Police Service targeted London's most serious and violent offenders through their violence suppression units. The Violence Crime Task Force are currently preparing for their annual Operation Summer Nights, which will focus on reducing violence as we emerge from lockdown. Enforcement is only one part of the response, and I've invested more than any other mayor in preventative activity. The VRU is supporting young people during the summer months. We're investing £1 million into a new after-school provision fund, specifically for young people at risk of violence or vulnerability. Earlier this month, I announced a new VRU funding of £900,000 to expand the MPS Divert Crime Prevention Programme, a successful police custody programme that supports young adults stay away from violence. The VRU also liaises with local authorities after serious incidents of violence, and where appropriate offers access to their critical incident fund to support the local response. And I've continued to support vital programmes like London Gang Exit and announced new funding for that today as well. As I begin my second term, I've renewed my commitment to tackling crime with an absolute focus on bringing down violence in all its forms.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And firstly, can I congratulate you on your re-election. Mr. Mayor, I note your answer to the questions from Assemblymember Prince and what you just said, and I welcome the many measures and initiatives that you are taking and have been taking over the last few years. There's, of course, a great deal more to be done to ensure that violence doesn't continue to rise to pre-COVID levels over the summer. It should also be noted, however, that there has been some progress in the last few years in reducing the overall number of young people injured as a result of knife crime, which there has been a reduction in since 2018. Of course, we can't be complacent, as you continue to keep reminding us, and one incident is one too many. What do you feel has contributed towards this from City Hall? And to some extent, you already answered this question. But also, looking ahead, how can you build upon this work and ensure that these numbers continue to fall over the next 3 years?
Yeah, good question, and thanks for your comments. I think the government's finally woken up to the fact that austerity has consequences on a whole host of issues, including crime. So the part of the equation they've done a U-turn on, which I welcome, is in police funding. So they announced 20,000 officers over 3 years. We have actually lost 21,000 officers over a number of years, but that's a by the by. We will find out soon what the third-year officers will receive are. We've only received about 1,300 in the first 2 years, 2,600. We need about 6,000 or the 20,000 to get the right number of officers. But the second part of the equation, the government's not recognised, which is the causes of crime, youth services, public services and so forth. The key point is making sure for the CSR, the comprehensive spending review this autumn, winter, we get decent settlement for those parts of public services that are important to prevent crime happening in the first place. And it's really important that we continue to deal with the causes of crime as well as enforcement.
Thank you. In your manifesto, this is what you had to say, and I quote, "I will increase visible neighbourhood policing," Bob is at the bit, "in high crime areas and town centres." How many extra local neighbourhood police officers do you intend to bring in over the next term? And will these extra officers be part of the violence suppression units, or are you intending to increase the size of existing dedicated ward policing teams?
No, these are additional officers. And so what I've given the Commissioner and the Met Police Service is additional resources, but I'm relying upon the advice from the police in relation to operational matters of where the officers go. So these are additional officers, and they'll be in the what's called, and apologies for this phrase, it's clunky, but hotspot areas. Yeah. And it'll be the police looking at the areas where there is high levels of crime, and there can be small parts of a ward, and then suppressing them. That's on top of the violent suppression work taking place across London, and that's on top of the violent crime task force work taking place in the high crime borough parts of London as well.
Thank you for clarifying that point, and Mr. Mayor, I wish you well over the next 3 years in your efforts to make London a safer city.
Thank you, Assembly Member Desai. The next two questions, Mr. Mayor, have been withdrawn. They are questions 1903 and question 2139. The next question after that is question number 1485, entitled Jobs, 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 Assembly Member Ahmad.
Well, can I congratulate you in your election? It was good to campaign with your family on election day as well. I'm sure they're really proud of your achievement. More than 300,000 Londoners have lost their jobs during the pandemic, and as Mayor, I'll do everything I can to help the whole city recover. I'm helping to protect existing jobs, support businesses to create new ones, and help Londoners who have lost their jobs get back to work. We've already introduced changes to the delegated adult education budget that allowed 20,000 Londoners earning below the London living wage to access training that they otherwise would have had to pay for. We will be launching a £32 million Good Work for All fund to deliver training, education and employability support to help Londoners enter good jobs in London's key sectors. I'll continue to tailor London's annual £330 million adult education budget to support Londoners hardest hit by the pandemic into good work. To help achieve this, we'll establish skills academies that connect Londoners to vital jobs in key sectors, including the green economy, culture and creative, health, hospitality and digital. Our new Let's Do London campaign will also play a critical role in protecting jobs and supporting the culture and hospitality sectors. This year, further investment from the adult education budget will go towards supporting London's skills needs as the economy reopens. We are working closely with London government partners, national agencies and anchor institutions across London to promote good work and improve partnership working so that Londoners can better access jobs and training opportunities. I will also work with others to protect and create jobs wherever I can. This includes influencing the business environment through business support, resilience grants and digital transition initiatives, as well as cultivating supply chain opportunities in planning, construction and urban development. Our £50 million Green New Deal will help to create thousands of new green jobs, and a new package of infrastructure works worth up to £1.5 billion recently announced by my London Infrastructure Group, which will help to kickstart the recovery.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and may I also offer my congratulations on election to your second term, and it was great to see you on election day. London, as you know, is the region with the most staff on furlough. Furlough covers up to 80% of an employee's salary for the hours that they can't work. As you know, the furlough scheme is going to start to end in June, effectively next week. What can the government do to support Londoners at risk of unemployment as their furlough scheme comes to an end?
Well, thank you for your question. So there's a couple of things that worry me in particular in relation to the government support. Firstly, it's good we persuaded the government to extend the support in relation to business rates, VAT relief and the furlough scheme. My concern is that when you look at the numbers of people furloughed, they tend to be disproportionately in poorer boroughs, deprived communities across London. And if there is no support when furlough ends and it's a cliff edge fall, those furloughed Londoners could become redundant Londoners, unemployed. And so a number of things I think need to happen. Firstly, in those sectors where there won't be a quick recovery, think of retail, culture, hospitality, I think the furlough scheme should be extended in those sectors for a bit longer. This is not a cliff edge fall. Secondly, I think the government should be providing a national jobs guarantee so those who lose their jobs can get back into work as soon as possible. And thirdly, I think we need to make sure that we protect the jobs that we've got, and that's why we've got the Let's Do London. So far, no support from the government. We've got £7 million, £6 million from us, £1 million from businesses. If we could have support from the government, we could really ensure we could protect those jobs to avoid the unemployment that you're worried about.
Thank you. When creating jobs, it's important to create good jobs with good working conditions and people that are paid at least the London living wage. Your manifesto commitment was to support workers' rights, which are particularly important now as we do not have the protections of the EU and a government that is sometimes described as hostile to workers' rights. How will you work to protect workers' rights this term?
Well, firstly, I'm of the view that it's not me that creates the jobs. I try and create an environment where jobs are created by the private sector and others. And so we've got to work with the private sector to have an environment that's conducive to job creation, but good job creation. The announcement of the last 24 hours of Uber recognising GMB is a good example of employers and workers working together, because I genuinely believe that when employers work with their employees through a trade union, it leads to greater productivity as well as better standards of work. We can't have a situation where London is good for business but not good for workers. I think it's possible to have London good for workers and business, and what I hope to do over the next 3 years is to build on the progress over the first 5 years. Good work standard, massively increase in the number of employers paying the London living wage, massively improving the conditions of the workplace through the good works of trade unions, but also banging the drum for investment in relation to London around the world and across the Europe, whether it's jobs, investment or tourism.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member Ahmad. The next question is question number 1670, improving air quality reporting in London, and that's from Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. Ella Adu Kissi Deborah's death was a tragedy, and we owe it to her family to do everything we can to improve London's air quality. Since 2016, my policies have contributed to a 94% reduction in the number of Londoners living in areas exceeding legal nitrogen dioxide pollution limits, and I expect to avoid almost 300,000 new cases of air quality related disease and over 1 million hospital administrations by 2050. But we need to go further and faster to protect the health of Londoners. I supported the family in getting a fresh inquest, and I share the coroner's concerns, and I'm committed to addressing them. In my first term, I instituted London's first alert system to warn Londoners about air pollution episodes. Alerts are displayed across the public transport and road networks, shared on social media, and sent directly to schools and the London boroughs. The NHS, PHE and the London Fire Brigade are contacted via the London Resilience Forum to cascade to their networks. My officers are currently undertaking a review of the alert system, including message testing and exploring additional methods to increase its reach, especially to the most vulnerable Londoners. London's air quality is now constantly monitored at around 120 reference locations through the London Air Quality Network. To expand London's monitoring capacity and make real-time information more widely available, in 2019, I piloted the Breathe London low-cost sensor network. This year, following the successful pilot, I've partnered with Bloomberg Philanthropies to fund 195 new sensors which have been provided for free to hospitals, schools and community groups. Live data from all monitors in London are available through the Breathe London website and London Air Quality Map, making it easier for Londoners to access reliable, real-time and hyper-local information. Providing this information is important, but of course it's not enough on its own. That's why I'll continue to implement bold policies to reduce air pollution and protect the health of Londoners, including expanding the ULEZ in October.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, Mr Mayor, and can I join with the congratulations from everyone else. It's fantastic to see you achieve more than 1 million votes last time, and again this, and of course it's fantastic to have someone from Tooting in my constituency doing that. Just to follow up from what you were saying about air quality, and I really appreciate the work that you've done over the last 5 years, and I know a lot of other people have as well. But we've got an environment bill going through Parliament. You have been calling for a new Clean Air Act. There is a possibility that something could be included in there, maybe perhaps legally binding targets so that the WHO guidelines come into UK law, because obviously it's not just a London problem, is it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves, Chair, that the last time there was major legislation was in the 1950s. And the concern many of us have is if we miss the opportunity to improve this bill, it could be another 50, 60, 70 years before we get another bite of the cherry. You've been working closely with UK 100. And what we're trying to do is to use COP26 and our cross-party working with civic society, civic groups, communities and so forth to really put some pressure on the National Parliament to make progress here. On a call this week with other mayors, Mayor Andy Street from West Midlands is hoping to host in July a meeting in Birmingham, bringing together not just the Metro Mayors but UK 100 and also the relevant member of the Cabinet to make sure they understand what's on the table here potentially, which is a groundbreaking environment bill that will lead to meaningful change or an opportunity missed, and I hope it's the former rather than the latter.
Well, I'm going to cross my fingers on that. Certainly, particularly, also, we found that there have been studies that have been done in the US now showing that the impact of PM 2.5 has been disproportionate in the same way that the pandemic was disproportionate in terms of its impacts, particularly on black and Asian and minority ethnic communities. I don't know whether we've been looking into doing that kind of research in London. Is there any evidence of that? And obviously, you just mentioned Birmingham, a city of very many diverse communities as well. It's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, some of the work that we've already done shows that the exposure experienced by poorer Londoners is far worse than those experienced by wealthy Londoners, and certainly the exposure of black, Asian, minority ethnic Londoners is far greater than the other ethnic groups as well. For me, this is an issue of social justice. It's the poorest Londoners, who are often black, Asian, minority ethnic, who are suffering the worst air quality, who are suffering the worst consequences from children having stunted lungs forever, to adults with a whole host of health issues from asthma, cancer, dementia, heart disease. That's why it's really important we address this in a comprehensive way. And I think the research in the USA confirms what we know in London, which is this is an issue of social justice.
Social justice and environmental justice. Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Cooper. The next question is question 1431, reaching zero carbon in London by 2030, and that's asked by Assembly Member Polanski.
Can I congratulate you on your election? Again, it's a bit, I'm sorry for we'll sort this out once the pandemic's behind us, but it's a bit weird looking there. It's even worse for Caroline, sorry. Many of the actions needed to reach this goal are laid out in my 1.5 degree climate action plan. My London plan is my London plan is requiring developers to go well beyond national building regulations, and we need to retrofit existing buildings at scale and support a clean energy system. We also need to increase active travel, decarbonise public transport and switch to electric vehicles. And we've no time to waste, which is why I've brought forward London's net zero carbon target to 2030. My focus is on accelerating climate action whilst bringing Londoners new job opportunities and skills and boosting our green economy. And I'm also supporting new replicable approaches through the Green New Deal Fund and the whole life cycle emissions policy of the London Plan. and tackling consumption-based emissions through reducing food waste in partnership with London. Retrofitting existing buildings remains one of the biggest challenges. To accelerate action, I've helped secure £160 million to reduce carbon emissions and cut energy bills from homes and public buildings. Tackling transport emissions through active travel and electric vehicles is also a priority. There has been a 20-fold increase in electric buses since I was first elected. London now has the largest fleet of its kind in Western Europe, and I'm making the case to government for funding to bring forward our target for all buses to be electric by 2030. We'll soon be powering the Tube, London's biggest single energy user, with green energy through a power purchase agreement. I'm working with TfL, the DfT and London councils to identify land for installing electric vehicle charge points. However, I only have powers to deliver less than half of the carbon savings needed. To deliver the remainder, the government must act on areas they control, such as setting strong decarbonisation requirements for existing buildings and or devolving powers and funding so London can go further and faster.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your kind words on my election. Congratulations to you as well. I applaud much of what you said on the list, and it was really good to hear your focus on retrofitting too. I'm determined, as someone elected across London to represent all Londoners, to push you further and faster when I believe that there's gaps in your plan. With that being said, we only have 9 years left to get to zero carbon by 2030. I'm determined on this Assembly to work collaboratively and cross-party. How do you think we can all work together, cross-party, more collaboratively, both as an Assembly and with you as a Mayor, to bring in a more grown-up politics to stop runaway climate change?
Well, firstly, the good news is, I mean, I don't want to make Sean or Caroline blush, but they've worked really closely in the last 5 years, and they've been critical allies, as is their job. Making sure that we work together when there is opposition from other people, but also to challenge me. That's your job. I think actually one of the things that we've done over the last 3 years in particular is accelerate the progress made because of the concern we've got. And I think, and I've said this publicly in a number of debates Sean and I had over the last 3 months, so I think the Greens deserve a lot of credit for that. And it's really important for us to take the public with us. The good news is, Caroline was at the first speech I gave on this at Great Ormond Street. Londoners are now, where they should be. Whereas if we were speaking 7, 8 years ago, there had been a public education role for us to play. I think that public education role is there. Actually, what you see now is young Londoners put pressure on mums and dads and carers and saying go further. I think that's a good place to be. I think the key thing we can work together on is lobbying the government. I think COP26 is an opportunity we won't get again. It's in Glasgow. That's a real opportunity. And I'm hoping that, working with Andy Street and others across the country who are from a different party who appear to get it, we can make really good progress here. But we've really got to seize this year as a time to do it.
Yeah, I agree with much of that, and it's really nice to hear that you want a different kind of politics as well. I think your focus on young people is really important. In the last few years, I've been out on the streets regularly with community organisers, young people, climate strikers. I was really disappointed at one point when you said we needed to get back to business as usual. I think you'd agree that business as usual has partly got us into this mess of runaway climate change. One idea was a citizens' assembly. Now, I know you've said this wouldn't be appropriate in the past for London because you think it should be a national thing. But considering COP26 is coming on its way, all the eyes of the world are on London. Can't you as London Mayor bring in a London Citizens' Assembly that could show us as a real example to the rest of the world of one of the greatest cities in the world and what we can do to get to zero carbon by 2030?
I think you do yourself a disservice thinking you aren't somebody who's a citizen who can make representations to the Mayor and to the Assembly. I hope you're not going to make yourself redundant. I think you've got a very important role to make sure that the views that you're talking about are heard by the Assembly.
Can I gently challenge that? Because I totally accept that, but I see us as a conduit listening to the people on the ground to then bring what they want to say into this chamber. But wouldn't it be good to also listen to them and have their voices in City Hall as well in a Citizens' Assembly?
Well, as it's your first Mayor's Question time, I'll allow you to interrupt me when I've not finished. But it won't happen again. But I think it's really important for us to see where there's been examples of assemblies that have worked. Camden is one example of a borough that's piloted this. I'm really keen to see the experience that they've got, and many others. I met recently with London Citizens again, as I meet on a regular basis. They bring a lot to the table. I think there's lots of examples of citizens across London who have their views heard loudly and clearly in the Assembly. And to me, as the Mayor, I'll continue to find other ways to engage with, listen to, and take with me Londoners.
Brilliant. I can't wait to work with you on that. And on that, I have no further questions.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Polanski. And just for the record, I'm the one that allows him to interrupt.
You're so far away, Chair. It's really weird. This.
Next question is 1410, and it's on Crossrail, and that's Assembly Member Pidgeon.
I'd be pleasantly surprised if the central section of Crossrail is open by December. I think a much more realistic opening time frame is the first half of next year, as TfL have consistently said since last summer. I know the Commissioner, Andy Byford, and the Crossrail Chief Executive, Mark Wilde, have tasked the team with delivering as soon as possible. I'd be worried if my Commissioner wasn't pushing the team to go further and faster, but I think the most likely outcome at this stage is an opening in the first 6 months of 2022. Following the opening of the central section, full services across the Elizabeth line from Reading and Heathrow in the west and between Abbeywood and Shenfield in the east will be introduced. The introduction of full services will be aligned with the National Rail timetable change. This transformational railway will deliver huge benefits to London and the rest of the UK and is key to our recovery from the pandemic. When complete, the Elizabeth line will cut journey times, create much needed capacity, transform accessibility and provide a huge economic boost, adding an estimated £42 billion to the UK economy. Significant progress has been made since the last Mayor's Question Time. Much of the central section infrastructure is now complete and fit-out is nearly completion at many stations. Several of the big engineering structures, including central section stations, shafts and portals, have now been handed over to TfL. This month the project hit the important milestone of starting trial running. This involves timetabled train movements in the central section and is a vital step towards opening the railway. It will take some time to complete this testing before a final phase known as trial operations begins. This involves people being invited onto trains and stations to test real-time service scenarios to ensure the readiness of the railway. Crossrail will, of course, Chair, continue to ensure Assembly members are kept fully updated on delivery of the Elizabeth line, which is vital to London and beyond.
Thank you very much for your answer and congratulations on your re-election, Mr Mayor. Both the Sunday Times and most recently the Evening Standard have reported, as you said, that the TfL Commissioner is hoping that Crossrail might open by Christmas of this year. And yet Stephen Hill, who's the project representative who scrutinises Crossrail, said last week that the trial running period looks like it's going to be very challenging ahead. So do you believe your Commissioner or the independent rep?
Well, I wouldn't phrase the question as you phrased it. I believe what the Commissioner is saying, that we hope to have it started in the first half of next year, as I said in my answer.
Okay. Do you accept that the delayed start to trial running could cause knock-on difficulties in finishing the stations and upgrading the software programmes on the new trains?
But potentially, yeah. But what the engineers and the transport team are trying to do is to do all the work required in the time we've got. They will not cut any corners in relation to safety. It's sometimes possible for trial running to be compressed if it's going well. One of the reasons you have trial running is to make sure you can get other problems out. That's the purpose of it. And so if there's more problems than was envisaged, then trial running can take place longer. The issue then is question, can trial operations be compressed? The key thing is to make sure it's safe and any issues are ironed out before it opens. You've seen examples in previous decades where big projects have begun prematurely, whether it's new terminals at Heathrow or other projects which have not landed well. We're keen to make sure it lands well when it opens, but also it's got to be safe, and so no corner will be cut, and the Commissioner and the Chief Executive are quite, it's the first thing we discuss is safety, and so we're not going to take any risk with safety in the interest of opening it a bit sooner. I think we will still meet the first 6 months of next year. Everyone's focused on opening as soon as possible, as safely as possible.
Okay, thank you. I think it's probably foolish to be talking about Christmas then when it should be, as you say, rightly next year. In terms of safety, are you aware that many safety authorizations for infrastructure and rolling stock, which are required from the Office of Rail and Road, and they were set for completion in spring, have still not been granted?
Those are conversations taking place. It's the volume of documentation. The good news is, you'll be aware of this, because you're on top of this, is it's now moved from a construction system to an operational system, which is really important because of the, it brings the ROGs in, the Railways and Other Guided Transport Systems Safety Regulations Rulebook. A lot of this is getting the people into the, I don't want to trivialise it, the paperwork, and so that needs to happen. And so TfL are working closely with the regulator to make sure all the safety reassurances are done. But there's a huge amount of safety checks that need to be done, but that's been done collegiately with the proper transparency and checks and balances.
But is this not an area you're worried about? Because if you don't get this through the Office of Rail and Road, you will not be able to open
the Chief Executive regularly raises this in meetings with me, but also the good news is Andy Lord from TfL is also on top of this now as well, because it's now gone from the Crossrail Limited to TfL, and so Andy Lord, who's the underground director, is working closely with Mark Well to make sure that the safety regulators are happy with the various checks that need to be taken. And as I said to you, we simply can't afford to cut any corners and not to have safety addressed. The issue is, can we address the volume of safety checks required by the time? The assurance I've been given is those sorts of checks should happen by the time the rail system is ready to open and shouldn't delay the rail system opening.
Okay, well, let's hope that ORR have the time to be able to do the work on their side. Given that the independent rep has stated that the budget envelope cannot be reliably underpinned, when will you provide Londoners with a full update of the expected final cost of Crossrail?
We won't know for a while. You'll be aware that the agreement we have with the government is to borrow £825 million against MSIL and the business rates supplement. The original estimate we had when we were negotiating with the government is £1.1 billion. So there's a difference between the £825 million and the £1.1 billion. Some of that difference is contingencies and risks. As we get nearer trial operations, we'll have a better idea of how many of those contingencies and risks will materialise. As soon as the Chief Exec and the Commissioner have a better idea of how close we are to getting to the top of the 825, obviously we'll have started discussions way before that. And since we've taken over, Crossrail being as transparent as we can be in relation to this. It's really important the Assembly are fully kept up to date in real time, as well as London as well, and we'll continue to be as transparent as we can be.
Thank you very much. I hope we're able to tell Londoners soon what the final bill will be. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is 1818, Housing in London, from Assembly Member Moema.
Can I also congratulate you on your election to the Assembly. It's good to see you. Building more social housing is my top priority. I beg your pardon, it's my top housing priority because the need for more low-cost rented homes is overwhelming. The evidence shows that 2/3 of the new homes needed each year in London should be social, rented or other affordable homes. This need has been reinforced by the impact of COVID-19 with a sharp increase in overcrowding and high numbers of households in temporary accommodation. That's why I'm pleased that over half of the homes delivered under my new Affordable Homes Programme 2021-2026 will be for social rent, giving more homeless and overcrowded households the stable affordable homes they need. In addition, my new Affordable Homes Programme will fund London Living Rent, which is an intermediate affordable housing product that I introduced in my first year as Mayor in 2016. London Living Rent is based on 1/3 of local household incomes and is designed to help middle-income households who want to build up savings to buy a home. The housing crisis still affects too many Londoners, and the evidence shows London's affordable housing sector needs significantly more government funding, £4.9 billion per year, for the next 10 years to meet the capital's level of affordable housing need. I'll continue to make the case to the government to invest in social housing, protecting construction sector jobs and providing a much-needed economic boost as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Almost 1/3 of Londoners rent privately, and the COVID-19 pandemic has underlined the precarious situation they face. Lockdown restrictions have exacerbated the health impacts of poor quality housing, and overcrowding has been linked to a greater transmission of COVID-19. Nearly 1/4 of private renters have seen their income fall during the pandemic, and 1 in 12 have received an eviction notice from their landlord. Despite having no formal powers, I'm doing all I can to support private renters.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and it's nice to see you here as well. So I'm really pleased to hear about the work that you're doing to encourage the government to fund more affordable housing here in London. And as we know, after the London plan was finally signed off, London, it says that 66,000 new homes are needed each year in London, and 43,000 of them, as you said, a large majority of them should be for affordable rent, but the government is only funding 7,000 a year for the next 5 years, which doesn't even kind of touch the sides of need here in London. Can you just elaborate on how we're going to meet the needs of Londoners and how much more we can do and to make sure that we get the funding that we need to meet that need for Londoners in need?
I think we've got to be straight with Londoners that the supply of new homes in London is not going to meet the demand our city has, and I've been straight with Londoners and I've been straight with the government about what the needs of our city are. And that's one of the reasons why you see the cost of homes being as expensive as they are in our city. One of the good pieces of news over the last 5 years was the work commissioned by Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, that Oliver Letwin did, which is to try and understand the diversity of London's housing market and why there is, for example, almost 300,000 homes given permission that aren't built. The answer is it's not in the private sector's interest to flood the market with homes for private sale. And I think we can help by having council homes, registered social landlords building homes, and others to help diversify the housing market. And we've got to continue trying to lobby the government to get more investment in affordable homes in our city. Yes, there's a role for private housing, but there also has to be a role for council housing and social rent housing and other forms of intermediate housing as well. At the same time, because it will take us some time to for supply to meet demand, to fix the private rental market as well. We have made progress. We're in a far better place than we were in 2016 when I became mayor, but there's still so much more to do. That's why it's important the government works with us, because unless you fix the housing crisis in London, you're going to continue to have some of the problems that you experience on a regular basis in your borough that we experience across our city.
Okay, thank you. And if I could just come to the point that you made about private renters. Just as a case study, we have a case in Hackney of the Somerford Grove renters, who are a group of tenants in 170 flats administered by an agency and owned by an offshore landlord, with no personal interest in the needs of the tenants that pay their rents. And during the pandemic, like many people affected by transport, working in the transport sector, they did the right thing and followed MHCLG guidance. They asked for rent reductions. They were, instead of given a rent reduction because they were working 0 hours and on contracts, they were handed eviction notices. And so what I want to know is, do you believe that the powers that councils have are enough to protect private renters? And do you think that councils are doing what they can to protect those people and are using those powers that they do have correctly?
So there are some councils that are using all the powers they have and using also the bully pulpit of town halls to try and put pressure on landowners, landlords, and there are some councils that aren't. But in both scenarios, councils haven't got enough powers. We've not got enough powers. And the government can't have a sort of laissez-faire approach towards this, because what happens is bad landlords take advantage of a situation none of us could have foresawn. And those tenants who are on 0 hours contracts have a choice. They can risk public health and go to work to get money to put food on the table and pay the rent, or they can follow the advice and stay home and self-isolate. They can't do both when they've got landlords who are putting pressure on them to pay the full amount of their rent. You and I both know that once the moratorium on evictions ends, because there's a backlog of rent arrears built up, you're going to see huge numbers of people potentially being evicted from their homes. How is it good to have the porters and cleaners that we need, transport workers, shop workers that we needed, the junior nurses and teachers that we needed, losing their homes and having to live further and further away from the places they work? And that's why it's really important for the government to fix the private rental market. In the short term, give us the powers to introduce a form of rent control with some form of oversight, because otherwise you'll see these Londoners who we need leaving the heart of our city.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is 1629, supporting London's leaseholders, from Assembly Member Clark.
Congratulations, it's good to see you in the Assembly, and hope you enjoy it. It's great to be campaigning with you so much during the campaign, and also you raised an issue that you raised a lot during the campaign as well, which is good to see. I've always supported leaseholders and residents affected by the building safety scandal, and will continue to do so. Recent fires, such as the one at New Providence Wharf, have emphasised yet again the pressing need to remediate buildings made with dangerous materials. I wrote to all building owners with unsafe ACM cladding in September 2020 to urge them to speed up remediation, and I wrote specifically to Ballamore about New Providence Wharf. It's wrong for leaseholders to bear the costs of historic errors they've played no part in causing. I've called for a long-term funding solution to make all buildings safe, regardless of height or the type of safety defect, which protects leaseholders from costs. This solution should include my proposals for a levy on private developers. I'm pleased the government has recently agreed in principle to a levy, and I'll be clear in my consultation response that it needs to go as far as possible to support Londoners and people across the country. In answer to a previous question, I highlighted the steps I've taken to ensure that new buildings in London meet tough fire safety standards and my ambition to improve consumer experience and communication. I'm proud to be a signatory to the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, led by affected leaseholders with input from the survivors of Grenfell Tower tragedy and Inside Housing. My Deputy Mayor for Housing, Tom Copley, meets with cladding campaigners regularly, and I personally joined a rally outside Parliament in early 2020. Prior to the pandemic, space was also provided at City Hall for quarterly meetings of cladding campaigners in London. The government needs to urgently resolve this crisis so leaseholders can get on with their lives without facing crippling costs to correct safety defects they played no part in causing. And of course, work collaboratively with the government whilst also continue to apply pressure to achieve this ambition for Londoners.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and congratulations on your excellent election results and your mandate from Londoners. As you know, this issue is a big issue for my constituents and for residents across London. I look forward to working with you to support Londoners caught up in the cladding and building safety defect scandal. Mr. Mayor, the government released the Building Safety Programme last June, the Waking Watch Relief Fund in December of 2021, and announced changes to EWS1 forms in March this year. Is this enough to end this crisis?
No, but I do welcome and support some of the positive steps taken by government. There's big problems with the approach so far. Buildings below 18 metres aren't covered with some of the financial support given by the government. Remediation that's not cladding isn't covered. And there are some properties where even with a fire alarm, you may need a wake-in watch in the absence of remediation of the cladding. And that's why the government's got to do a lot more. You'll have met people who, because of the EWS1 forms, can't sell their properties because of the issues about assurance they need to give. I think the government should be stepping up financially to resolve the issue of these buildings that are unsafe to be made safe, and then get back the monies they spend from the landowners and others. You'll be aware that actually a lot of the owners have offshore businesses, and it's really difficult for leaseholders to get a solution from them. That's why the government should step in and sort this out as soon as possible.
Mr. Mayor, at the October 2020 FREP committee meeting, Ritu Saha, a founder of the UK Cladding Action Group, asked for support from your office to look at inconsistencies around waking watches in buildings in London. Will you commit to investigate these issues further on behalf of Londoners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor, has done lots of work on this. There's a number of issues here which need looking into. You mentioned the inconsistencies. There's the remediation works. There's waking watches. There's inconsistencies in relation to safety measures. You'll be aware of some of the stuff that the National Fire Chiefs Council has said. I'm more than happy, either myself or Tom, to do further work in relation to this. A lot of this is outside our powers and our purviews. But we're trying to help groups and individuals who've got nobody else to turn to, and so we're going outside of our powers to try and help them, because that's one of the roles we can play, is to support them where possible, not just being the advocate for these leaseholders, but trying to assist in relation to the inconsistencies that you referred to.
Yeah, many thanks for that. And finally, you and I have both signed up to the UK End Our Cladding Scandal's 10-step plan, which includes, at point 9, a call that mental health support must be offered to affected residents. What can you do as mayor to actively support leaseholders and to reduce the distress and anxiety that they are forced to live with?
You know, I've met leaseholders who have seriously thought about killing themselves. I mean, just think about that. Their dream was to be a homeowner, and it's turned into worse than a nightmare. And so I think one of the things we can do is try and persuade the government to improve the service they provide. They've got this independent advice service called Lease, and so the Homes for Londoners Board have asked the government to review the help they give to leaseholders. I use the word albatross to describe what some of these homes have become to these residents. So yes, we need to improve the support given to leaseholders, residents, particularly around mental health support, but actually one of the ways to ameliorate some of the mental health situation is by fixing the problem. And so I think we've got to do a number of the things you refer to try and help these residents, Londoners, who are really suffering huge anguish in the meantime. And the sooner the government can support them financially, I think, the more that'll help with the consequences of being a leaseholder in these dangerous buildings.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Clark, you're content with that reply?
I'm content.
Thank you. The next question is question 1801, jobs for London's young people, and that will be asked by Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. The jobs and skills challenge facing all Londoners is alarming in scale, and these ONS figures confirm the impact on younger Londoners. I welcome much of the government's actions to protect jobs and create new ones, but it's also clear that we need tailored local responses to support our young people. I have introduced new flexibilities to the adult education budget to provide more job-focused training for Londoners most affected by the pandemic, which enabled 21,560 young Londoners aged between 19 and 23 to receive fully funded training. The £32 million Good Work Fund will provide skills and employability support for Londoners aged 19 and above. I'll soon be investing more funds to establish an academies programme to support Londoners most affected by the pandemic, as well as delivering a new careers hub, a co-investment between GLA, ESF and the Careers and Enterprise Company. But there's more to be done. The London Recovery Board's New Deal for Young People mission aims to ensure that by 2024, all young people in need have access to a personal mentor and access to local youth activities. London's anchor institutions, through their new charter, are playing a key advocacy role for good jobs and fair pay to help Londoners' employers, to help London's employers build back better and to address structural inequalities in the labour market, benefiting young people looking for good work.
Thank you for that, Mr Mayor. London's a young city. Nearly a third of its citizens are under 25, and yet they are the most at risk of unemployment. The number of under 25s in employment is currently at the lowest on record, and that's particularly true in disadvantaged communities such as mine in Edmonton and Tottenham, where the employment that is available is often insecure in nature. So I would like to know, what specific targeting will you be doing to those areas where those young people most at risk are based?
Look, this is a really important issue. I mean, you and I both lived through the 1980s when you had generations written off because of the mass unemployment. And in fact, one of the concerns that I have is what you've highlighted, which is it's in the most deprived communities where there's the largest number of people either furloughed or having lost their jobs. More than 300,000 over the course of the last 15 months in London, more than 1 million people currently furloughed. So we're micro-targeting our assistance to those boroughs that need the most support. That includes how we're micro-targeting the adult education budget, but also where the Skills Academy will be doing work. So you've seen the progress of the Construction Academy. We're going to see the Green Academy, digital, creative, health and social care, particularly focusing in those parts of London where you've got young Londoners not in employment, education or training who need that helping hand to fulfil their potential.
Thank you, that's good to know. And I think this is a real opportunity to actually try and level up some of that inequality in our city. And you have introduced the Good Work Standard, but obviously you have many links with employers. Will you do your best to make sure that they target their job and training opportunities to those geographical areas which have high numbers of young people?
One of the things we're trying to do is to persuade the government that if levelling up is going to be meaningful, it's got to include levelling up intra-region. You'll be aware some of the poorest boroughs and wards in the country are in London, and that's what your question alludes to. So the good news is we're working really well with not just the private sector, but also what we call the anchor institutions, the NHS, universities, Transport for London, Met Police Service, etc., to make sure they also are helping us ensure that it's the Londoners in the poorest part of our city who normally don't get the opportunities, what I call underserved communities, who get the assistance to get the skills for the jobs of tomorrow. It's really important we don't leave them behind.
Thank you, and obviously I think, well I will, and I'm sure all Assembly members will be advertising those opportunities to our young people. Now, Assembly Member Duval has already asked you about the Kickstart scheme, which has been a little slow in getting started. But can I ask, what other long-term assistance does the government need to provide to support our young people? And what other schemes could be devolved to the GLA? Because I think being closer to our local communities, we can often do things better.
Well, hopefully Londoners have started to see the difference us being in charge of adult education is starting to make. Look at how quick we were to move towards giving free training for those on the minimum wage. to get a living wage. Look at our speed in relation to making sure Londoners for whom English is their first language were given assistance. Look at the speed with which we announced the new academies, green, digital, creative, health and social care, as well as construction. If the government were to devolve to us 16 to 19, that would be a real game changer. Because if we can get these Londoners early, we think that's a pipeline of talent we can be utilising.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member McCartney. The next question is question number 2059, Bexley and Bromley safety, and that's being asked by Assembly Member Fortune.
Can I genuinely congratulate you in your election? You should be really proud, and it's big shoes you've got to fill as well, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you'll do it well. My top policing priority remains the same, to make London a safe city by being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. That means continuing to do everything in my power to invest in the police and fund service that will help prevent violence and crime. I've invested a record £1 billion in the MPS, put in an extra 1,300 police officers on London streets. The number of dedicated ward officers has continued to increase, with 1,578 dedicated ward officers in post, supported by 626 PCSOs. London police officer recruitment is now at its highest level since December 2010. I set up the Violence Reduction Unit to give young people positive experiences away from crime and help prevent violence. The VRU's public health approach has already benefited 80,000 Londoners. Bexley and Bromley have each benefited from £50,000 investment from the VRU. Alongside this, the London Crime Prevention Fund provides Bexley with over £250,000 and Bromley with over £317,000 worth of funding for projects and programmes that span from crime reduction initiatives, local youth projects and domestic abuse services. Each borough has selected 2 local volume crime priorities to focus on based on local knowledge, crime, data and police intelligence, which is set as a priority alongside antisocial behaviour. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this year MOPAC agreed to continue with the existing priorities selected for each borough. For both Bromley and Bexley, these priorities were burglary and non-domestic violence with injury, and crime levels in these priority areas have reduced in both boroughs. Borough data shows that non-domestic violence with injury has decreased by 13% in Bromley and 24% in Bexley. The priorities shared by the Commissioner and me will be delivered most effectively by working together with communities, local boroughs and the government. This includes the London Assembly, and we want to work with you over the weeks and months ahead to discuss issues of common interest, developing a police and crime plan that delivers for Londoners.
Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your kind words as well. I can assure you Gareth Bacon regularly reminds me I have big shoes to fill. So.
We all believe you as well, you know.
Mr. Mayor, just over a year ago, my family were the victims of a burglary, and it's an incredibly and deeply invasive and upsetting crime. My daughter's window was smashed, my son's room ransacked, and we lost irreplaceable family items that will be gone from us forever. Now, this was a crime that was repeated over 2,200 times in Bexley and Bromley in 2020 and 21, despite the lockdown. It was repeated over 4,300 times the year before. So, Mr. Mayor, what are you doing to make sure that the residents of Bexley and Bromley are safe in their own homes, and that this time next year, burglary rates don't return to where they were pre-pandemic?
First of all, I'm really sorry for you being the victim of burglary. I mean, you're right, it's invasive. Your families are traumatised in their own home. The place they should be the most safe is their castle. One of the things that we've done to see the improvements in the figures, and by the way, a reduction is no consolation to you who's been the victim of burglary and stuff, but we are seeing progress in reducing both these areas, and it probably explains why Bexley and Bromley may have chosen burglary as one of the 2 priority areas, because of the experience residents were having at being an issue for them, which shows how it does work in relation to the police reflecting the priorities of the residents, which is the reason why boroughs are given a say of what the priority areas should be. So some of the money that City Hall's given to the police has been used in burglary, anti-burglary work. So marking property is a good deterrent, but also means that property can be recovered when it's found. We've seen, some of our fortune, that where you have the work done on anti-burglary around marking property, around good signage in windows, around neighbourhood watch schemes, around high visibility policing, around council supporting CCTV, around unmarked vehicles and marked police vehicles, a big reduction in burglary compared to other boroughs that haven't got it as a priority and haven't seen that work. And so I'm more than happy to have you sit down with the BCU team as well as the Commissioner's team to explain the things we're doing. If there's additional things we can be doing in the boroughs that have burglary as a priority, we'll be happy to do that. The advantage of having burglary as priorities in those boroughs that have them is we can then learn the lessons from those boroughs and use them elsewhere, even if burglary is not a priority. But I'm hoping to see a further reduction. I mentioned the numbers, which again are no consolation to you. We're going to see further reductions going forward as well.
That's very kind, and thank you for your words as well. I think you'll agree that solving crime also prevents crime. Taking criminals off the streets means that they can't commit any more crime. And just looking at some of that data from the dashboard, we're looking at violence has increased from 9,426 in 2016-17 to 11,520 in 2021, which is an increase of 22%. But the sanction detection rates, so these are some sort of formal sanction, be it a charge or a caution, that fell from 21.3% down to 9.9%. Moving to vehicle offences, we've got an increase from 4,483 in 2016-17 to 5,776 in 2020-21, which is an increase of 26.6%. But again, that sanction detection rate fell from 3.3% to 1.3%. So what plans do you have as Mayor to increase the number of crimes that are actually solved?
Oh, this is a regular theme of conversation, not just with the Commissioner, but with the criminal justice system partners. You'll have seen the huge media coverage, rightly so, at the report this week in relation to rape and the low numbers of detection and sanction rates. When you speak to the police, one of the things they will tell you, which is actually accurate and correct, is the police are often arresting people for some of the crimes that we're concerned about. The issue is what happens in the rest of the criminal justice system. The Commissioner speaks regularly with the Director of Public Prosecutions and others in the court system. There is a big issue at the moment, you'll be aware of, over the last 15 months with backlog in courts, with attrition for witnesses not continuing with a prosecution. And the police are focusing on making sure that we improve attrition rates on all sorts of crime. Rapes had the coverage in the media for the right reasons, and we welcome that. But other areas of criminality haven't had the same coverage. Burglary is one of them. Often, and you'll have heard this from conversations you have with police officers, it's a small number of people doing a disproportionate number of burglaries. So if you can catch them, arrest them, and they're properly prosecuted and dealt with, you'll see a big reduction just by one or two people being caught in a particular borough. So the police are seized of this. You'll be aware we've got very little locus over other parts of the criminal justice system, from courts, prison, probation, and so forth. We do meet regularly with them. They share our concerns. None of them is, in denial about the challenges they face. But I can reassure you, the police, which is the part of the jigsaw puzzle that I control, do work incredibly hard to detect, catch those responsible, and work with others to make sure those are properly brought to justice.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. I agree with you completely that the police do work really, really hard. So we'll be looking to see those detection rates going up for next year.
That's a fair challenge.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Fortune. The next question is question 1432, New Police and Crime Plan, and that's Assembly Member Russell has asked that.
Thank you, Chair. I'm clear on the priorities that will be reflected in my new police and crime plan. First, we must continue to reduce violent crime, particularly amongst younger people. That's why I established England's first violence reduction unit, and while I'll continue to work closely with the Commission to keep Londoners safe, bring violent criminals to justice, and get deadly weapons off our streets as a matter of urgency. Another priority will be to refresh our strategy for countering violence against women and girls, building on the work that's been done over the last 5 years, backed by a record investment. The refreshed violence against women and girls strategy will take a public health approach to tackling these appalling crimes. I'll also reaffirm my commitment to delivering my action plan for transparency, accountability and trust in policing. Work is already underway to make our police service more representative of the city it serves. I'm pleased to say the Met Police Service has record numbers of Black, Asian and minority ethnic officers, but we must do more collectively to increase trust and confidence in policing, particularly in Black communities. And I'll continue to champion victims' rights. That's why I'm pleased to have reappointed Claire Waxman as London's Independent Victims Commissioner. Working with Claire and all of our partner agencies, I'll continue to drive progress towards a justice service that puts victims at the heart of its work. Under my leadership, and because of the difficult decisions I've made in my first term, City Hall funding for the MPS has reached record levels. I won't be afraid to make these difficult decisions again in the future to make London a safer city. The priorities I've described here was set out very clearly in my election manifesto, and with the renewed mandate I have to deliver for Londoners, work is already underway on developing them into my new police and crime plan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And can I ask, when will your police and crime plan be published?
I'd hope to begin consultation in summer, but can I, Chair, with your permission, email the member to give her more precise dates?
Thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing the draft plan. Now, you've started with a lot of community engagement in your action plan, because you know as well as anyone else that a paper or online consultation simply won't reach widely enough to all the communities in London. So how will Londoners be involved in developing your new police and crime plan?
Chair, I'm really happy to work with the relevant committee, Police and Crime Committee, in relation to talking through the consultation plans we have. And if there's any ideas members have, we're more than happy to take those on board. I suspect, my fingers are crossed, that we'll be out of the pandemic by the time of summer, so we won't have to worry about the health risks. But Chair, can I suggest that my Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime works with members of the Assembly to make sure we have a proper consultation, which is really important for a police and crime plan.
Is that acceptable to you, Assembly Member Russell?
That would be very, very helpful. Yes, and I look forward to hearing about that. Yes, because the important thing is that Londoners are right at the very heart of the plan, and the other thing that's really important is that you're looking at those first principles for policing. So, for example, restoring the original principles of policing by consent. Are you going to be looking at the basic principles of policing in this police and crime plan?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Just right back to the basic Peel principles.
The short answer is we're a city of more than 10 million when you include commuters and visitors. With the best will in the world, 33,000 officers by themselves can't keep that city safe without the consent and help of members of the public, and that's why trust and confidence is so important. And one of the things I try to get across, Caroline, is the issue of lack of trust and confidence from black Londoners affects all of us. Because if somebody's a victim of crime today and they don't come forward, the perpetrator could be somebody else, point Peter made in relation to detection and sanction, could commit further crimes going forward. That's why it affects all of us. And that's why it's important for us to, have improved trust and confidence. And you'll have seen the really welcome comments from Deputy Commissioner Steve Howes this week, a year on from George Floyd's brutal murder, about the commitment that police have to improve trust and confidence, and that's integral to how we police by consent.
Thank you. And the other thing that's really important is obviously the public health approach, which you've been speaking about. Now, for example, will you commit to putting violence reduction unit trained Rise Up youth officers in every borough?
I'm not sure if I can give that commitment now. What I'm willing to do is get back to you in relation to we've not written. You're asking me to commit to something in a police and crime plan that's not written yet. But I'm more than happy to take on board any ideas you've got.
If you can have a look at that. They're currently, I believe that there are people in 27 boroughs, but it would be good to have
fund them. We know that, yeah.
In every single borough, so then yes, I think the only other thing I'd like is for you to tell me a bit more about how you plan to put public health approach into your police and crime plan. Do you have?
So the public health approach is something that's intrinsic and integral to the violence reduction unit work we do. It's also something that needs to be an integral part of the violence against women and girls work we do. Because enforcement is one end of the spectrum, but you've got to deal with the pipeline of young people getting involved in criminality, and also the male perpetrators who are responsible for a vast majority of the violence against women and girls. And the public health approach, which you know as well as anybody else, is about dealing with, the way I describe it to members of the public is, stop the infection occurring in the first place, deal with the infection, stop the infection spreading, using data and a holistic approach. And we've got now some of the world's best data in our city that other cities are envious about, so we can micro-target where we have intervention at an early stage, but also enforcement. And we're particularly keen to use that for the limited resources that police have. It's an operational matter. In answer to the previous question, I mentioned hotspots. I think it's Keith Prince's question. So you will be seeing over the next phase the police targeting their resources in those boroughs where there's a bigger concern around violence against women and girls or against violent crime. But the police and crime plan is quite, at its core, will have a public health approach.
that's really reassuring to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assembly Member Russell. The next question is question 2195, Facebook's end-to-end encryption, and that question is asked by Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. The National Crime Agency is clear that if social media companies apply end-to-end encryption without careful consideration, children will undoubtedly be at risk, and some of what offenders say and do will be beyond the reach of both law enforcement and the tech companies themselves. In fact, last week the head of MI5 also voiced his concerns about this issue. Whilst I understand the importance of protecting individual privacy and personal cybersecurity, experts are clear that end-to-end encryption can allow criminals an unacceptably high level of protection from law enforcement. Tech companies have a responsibility to ensure their services aren't used for illegal purposes, and I urge the sector to work with the government and law enforcement to find solutions to this issue. I was pleased to see the government's online safety bill introduced for parliamentary scrutiny. I fully support strong regulation for tech companies through a statutory duty of care to their users. I've been vocal about the role of the internet in facilitating crime and spreading violent messages for many years, and I've taken direct action to mitigate these harms. My Countering Violent Extremism programme teamed up with Google.org to deliver the £800,000 Shared Endeavour Fund, London's first ever grant fund for civil society projects that counter extremism and radicalisation. Many of the projects this delivered to thousands of Londoners last year raised awareness of and built resilience to online harms. And through my Civic Innovation Challenge, I've partnered with the police and Raven Science to create and pilot the I Reported app, a new anonymous public referral tool for online terrorist content. Through this pilot, the app has increased referrals to the police by 15%. I do not underestimate the importance of privacy and strong cybersecurity, but we know online platforms are being exploited to plan crimes and spread harm. These challenges require whole-of-society solutions, and I'll continue to play my role. But tech companies must do their bit for public safety by ensuring their platforms hinder criminals and protect vulnerable people.
Mr. Mayor, well, you are now a second-term mayor, a convening mayor. Could you pump up the volume on that convening, please, Mr. Mayor? How about a summit to actually get the people who are responsible for these large organisations to actually do what they must do?
The good news is the government is already doing a lot of this. I mean, when Sajid Javid was the Home Secretary, he went to Silicon Valley doing exactly what you want him to do, and Priti Patel's building that work. So I'm more than happy to amplify that work with the government. But just to reassure you, I think roles reversed where I'm praising the government, but the government is doing a lot on this, and we want to work with the government on this. We do our own engagement, and we pump up the volume our own way. But actually, we haven't got the power the government has. But I'll carry on doing my bit and working closely with the government. But I can reassure you, there's no danger of me reducing the sound of the volume.
Okay, did you read the article in the Times that Mr. Basu wrote? He wrote on a number of particular pertinent issues. The other thing he said, he advocated Prevent, saying he continues to battle the toxic perception and asked where the senior leaders are coming out about their safeguarding responsibilities. Did you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, Neil and I, we regularly discuss this. I think Prevent is the only show in town, and that's why it's really important. Look, it's not perfect, but we've got to make sure that we stop young people in particular who may be vulnerable being, inverted commas, brainwashed by either charismatic orators or by others who are brainwashing them. And by the way, we've seen this on the extreme right as well, about vulnerable young Londoners being brainwashed. And Prevent, it's not perfect, but it does a good job in addressing the issue of extremism and violent crime, and we will continue working closely with the police. The way to think about it is it's a safeguarding issue. If you think about it as a safeguarding issue, would you not step in if you saw a young person being groomed by a sexual gang? And that's the way to think about it. And so we've got to do a lot more to get the communities confident in this, whether it's, I don't want to be flippant and say rebranding, but whether it's, having examples of successful Prevent interventions or else. But Neil Basu is spot on in relation to the importance of this.
And will we see more actual concrete actions from you, do you believe, with a new police and crime bill? Plan, rather.
In my answer to the question you asked, Tony, I did talk about some of the work we're doing around countering violent extremism. World-leading stuff, by the way. The app has been a real welcome by the police, because you're seeing more people report things anonymously. We're also doing really good work with, I mentioned Google.org. And the point is they should be able to spot some of this stuff taking place online. We particularly were concerned during the COVID lockdown, where you were seeing a reduction in physical activity, but an increase in online activity. So it's a big challenge for us, and you know this better than I do, as well as I do. We're a global city that is a target for terrorists and extremists. We've got to be resilient and vigilant at all times.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is question 1787, Economic Recovery and Inequality, and that's asked by Assembly Member Hirani.
Can I say, Chair, how lovely it is to see you sitting around this Assembly as an Assembly Member. I note that Navin Shah is in the House. I'm not sure that's a good or bad thing for you, Croops, but yeah, good to see former Assembly Member Navin Shah in the City Hall as well. The pandemic has affected all Londoners, but far from being a great leveller, it has disproportionately exposed and exacerbated existing structural inequalities. The London Recovery Board has made a clear commitment that our recovery should narrow social, economic and health inequalities, and that this commitment should be woven throughout the whole programme. Each of the 9 missions will contribute to this goal. I've targeted the £330 million adult education budget towards Londoners hardest hit by the pandemic, supporting them to get back into good work. And we're working with Londoners' anchor institutions to take a leading role in helping London's employers build back better and address inequalities in the labour market. But with the cliff edge at the end of the government support coming, we will have to work together to avoid a further crisis for jobs and skills across London, which would again threaten to hit the worst off hardest. A fair economic recovery depends on collaboration with London boroughs as partners in London's recovery. Together, we're addressing our shared challenges and inequalities at every level of London government and with other partners across the city. And we also want to put politics aside and work with the national government to really drive forward London's recovery, which we know is crucial for the recovery of our whole nation.
Thank you. Congratulations on your re-election as well, and also paying tribute to my predecessor, Navin Shah, in the public gallery. I won't mention anything about Sir Alex Ferguson being there at the Europa League final last night with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. But we've seen food bank usage increase during this pandemic, and in the height of it, you stepped in to support food banks across London when they were running short of supplies. And I thank you for taking the time a few weeks ago to visit London Community Kitchen in Harrow to see firsthand the work that they are doing to support people in Brent and Harrow. How will you work towards ensuring that no Londoner goes hungry in your new mayoral term?
Well, can I just say, it was both inspiring and heartbreaking to visit the London Community Kitchen in Harrow with you and with Navin as well, and with Gareth Thomas and the leader of Harrow Council as well, Graham, because you had brilliant Londoners doing brilliant work helping those who need support. But you sort of think, how is it possible in the 5th or 6th richest city in the world that we're relying upon food banks? And what was heartbreaking was the numbers of people in work they were helping. So people who were doing a hard day's work, often 2 jobs, were relying upon food banks. You mentioned London Community Kitchen, but there are many others across London. Felix, another one, doing great work. And that can't be right. And so, of course, we'll carry on helping address the issue of food insecurity, work with food aid partners. You'll be aware of the financial support we're given to the London Community Response Fund. We're going to do what's at the core of this. At the core of this is we need to have better paid, good jobs in our city. And the idea behind the investment around adult education is to give Londoners the skills for the future-proof jobs created in our city. And it's really important we give them well-paid, high-skilled jobs going forward.
Also within the issue of inequalities is the issue of child poverty as well. And you may have seen this week highlighted by the End Child Poverty Coalition last week, a shocking 38% of children living in poverty in the capital. Whilst the levels of power are in government's hands, such as putting an end to some of the punitive welfare reforms that they've put in place, what action can you take in your second term to tackle this issue, which the pandemic will have worsened?
Yeah, it is a big issue. The child poverty situation, that's of serious concern in our city. The key things we've got to do is try and reduce the cost of living in London. We can reduce the cost of living by a number of ways. Firstly, I'm determined to keep free travel for our 18-year-olds. You'll be aware of the attempt to remove this over the last few months. If you're the parent of 2, 3, 4 children going to the 2, 3, 4 schools, you know the cost of travel. Second thing is to reduce the cost of living. Really important that we try and avoid a situation where those who rent privately have big increases in their rents when we come out of the lockdown. We need more genuinely affordable homes in our city. And the third big issue we've got to do is make sure that people get a decent pay for doing a hard day's work. It's really important we make sure we address that. You'll be with a massive priority made in new employers paying the London living wage. I want London to be a living wage city. That's the aspiration, and we're going to work our socks off over the next 3 years to make London a living wage city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Assembly Member Polanski.
Mr. Mayor, have you now come round to lobbying for a basic income, as the Assembly has?
I've been quite clear in relation to some of the lessons we learned over the last 15 months. I've been interested in relation to support given to families who were furloughed. It's important to assess how successful that's been. I think it's been successful. There are those parts of the world that have piloted this. I think, I forget the particular Scandinavian country, you probably don't forget, maybe Finland, that piloted this and stuff, and there's mixed lessons from Finland. It's a conversation that it's worth us having in relation to the advantages of a universal basic. I'm well aware of the critics of a UBR, but I think it's a conversation that we should be having.
Good to hear.
Well timed, Assembly Member Polanski. The Green Group is now out of time. So, the next question is question 2110, Londoners' safety, and that's asked by Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. The safety of Londoners will always be a top priority for me as Mayor. I'm clear as I start my second term that I'm absolutely determined to drive down violent crime across our city. The work happening to tackle violence is one example of the scale of the effort I've led to make London safer. Despite opposition by some in the Assembly, I've made the tough decisions year after year to increase City Hall funding to the police to a record level. As a direct result, there are now 1,300 more officers at our streets than would otherwise have been the case. City Hall funding has helped to create the MPS Violent Crime Task Force and Violent Suppression Units, which are hard at work pursuing dangerous individuals and getting deadly weapons off the streets. Violent crime across London has started to go down before the pandemic hit and has continued to reduce. But we know levels of violence are still too high and too many families are losing their loved ones. The Commissioner and I are determined to do everything we can to sustain the reductions in violence we have seen over the last year and drive it down still further. I'm also determined to be tough on the underlying causes of crime. That's why I've set up England's first violence reduction unit and why 110,000 young Londoners have benefited from projects funded through the Young Londoners Fund. I've also put more funding into specialist services supporting highly vulnerable young people caught up in crime, such as the pioneering County Lines Rescue and Response Service and the London Gang Exit Service. I'll continue with the same determination in all aspects of keeping our city safe, including bringing forward an updated violence against women and girls strategy and refreshing Lord Harris's review into London's preparedness for a major terrorist incident. Work is now underway, Chair, on my new police and crime plan, which will set out my agenda for the safety of London over the next 3 years. I look forward to working with the Assembly and the Government to achieve our shared goal of a safer London.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your answer and congratulations on your re-election. You may remember some years ago that police in riot gear were dispatched to Hyde Park to break up what had been billed as a water fight and a free party, and it descended into chaos, leading to a police officer and 2 members of the public being stabbed. As we emerge from lockdown, I'm speaking to lots of young Londoners now who are receiving messages about big gatherings, getting together, wanting to exercise newfound freedoms that we're all hoping will happen soon. What specific work is being done to address these gatherings to make sure that they don't descend into violence, that we don't have London have a lot of, in some cases, illegal gatherings that then end up in violence?
Well, thank you for your question. I think I mentioned in answer to a previous question the work being undertaken to address the concerns the Commissioner and I share about an increase in violent crime as lockdown measures are eased. Of course, it's perfectly understandable for young people to want to meet up. There's a pent-up frustration of being locked away basically for the last 14, 15 months, but it's got to be lawful, safe. And so the police are alert to safe, good, healthy physical activity in Hyde Park and other places, and potential criminality and social behaviour. So there's planning undertaken for Operation Summer Nights in relation to work to address the concerns you've got. I think maybe in summer 2017, the Hyde Park incident you referred to, 2018. But you're right, it was really alarming for many other users of the park, as well as the police and others there. Separately, the violent suppression unit that's been working since the lockdown first began now cover all of London. We're talking about more than 600 officers. and I've been out and about with some of them, I think you have as well. They're officers based in their communities who know not just parts of a ward where there tends to be high violence, but they know individuals. They've built up a relationship, often a friendship, and so they get intelligence. And so that intel is something we didn't have before. That intel is useful, but we are mindful of the issue you raised. I obviously don't want to advertise all the things we're doing, but we're well aware of the concerns.
Is there any conversations being had about specific events? For instance, the We Are Festival, the police have registered quite, if it's to go ahead, have a real objection to it because they believe because very few festivals are going ahead, it would be a real magnet for drug gangs, for rival gangs, because they have no other outlet to sell drugs, etc. Are there specific conversations going on about actual events that may well happen to prevent those events, to police them in a different way? Are we looking at each individual event that we at least know of and what we can do about them?
Yeah, Chair, I mean, without disclosing too much, we on a daily basis, there's a look at events coming ahead. So I, for example, will receive on a daily basis events that have taken place in the last 24 hours, events taken place, but it's on a week-by-week basis. So we've mapped out the summer, basically, of big events. The other thing is, it's not linked with your question, Sean, but it's relevant, is the Euros. Something I've raised publicly, so I'm not giving away any issues or casting aspersions. Historically, England versus Scotland is a challenge. And so that's just one example, but just to reassure you, a lot of work taking place in relation to keeping our city, helping the recovery as we come out of lockdown, but making sure everyone is kept safe.
Okay. Over recent years, very recently, we've seen a lot of large disruptive protests in the centre of London, and often they can turn violent. We all know what's happened recently. But what is done in particular to make sure that central London, because obviously it's very attractive, as you said many times, what's been done particularly to make sure that central London doesn't become a no-go area, that we don't have protests just popping up that we're unaware of or unable to police?
Well, most protests are peaceful, lawful and safe, and the police aren't involved in the protests. The key thing is for those organising protests to work with the police, because you and I both know often you can have 3 or 4 protests in the same footprint, often with different points of view that can provide an additional challenge other than a steady grinding to a halt. And so my key message to anybody who wants to protest is to work with the police. The police will not stop lawful, peaceful, safe protest. Work with the police. There are obviously new regulations and new laws during a lockdown that people need to be aware of. But, one of the great things about living in a democracy is people have a right to protest. We're not saying don't protest, but work with the police so you don't advertently or inadvertently break the law. It's really important that we respect the rights people have, but also respect the need of our city to go about its business.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall.
Congratulations, Mr. Mayor, on your reappointment. On a more specific issue of the safety of Londoners, I wanted to ask you about the safety of Jewish Londoners in light of the horrific instances of anti-Semitism that we've seen in the city these last few weeks. I was contacted last night by the London Jewish Forum regarding a really harrowing incidents, really, of police just standing by while anti-Semitic abuse is shouted from crowds and protests. They were extremely concerned that what is happening is that the police are effectively just containing this foul abuse rather than actively stopping it. That their approach has also been more passive than active, and the impression that many have is that they're not being treated in the way that they should be. So what assurances can you give London's Jewish community that you and the police are taking these instances with the seriousness that you should and treating it as the vile racist abuse that it absolutely is?
Well, thanks for raising this really important issue, and thanks for your kind words. Over the last few weeks, the Commissioner and I have been in close contact in relation to this issue, and I'm surprised by the comments of the Londoners you referred to, because the police have spent a lot of time engaging with, listening to and working with Jewish Londoners. Firstly, it's worth me repeating what I've said in the past. I know you share this view. Hate crime is not acceptable in our city, anti-Semitism is not acceptable in our city. It is racist. And you and I have met many Jewish Londoners who feel the ripples of hate, even though they don't directly have the anti-Semitism aimed at them because they're Jewish. And it's really important we understand the distress it causes to Jewish Londoners. I'm more than happy to look into this specific case you referred to, but the police are not taking a hands-off approach in relation to this. You'll be aware of the speed with which they moved in relation to making arrests about a high-profile incident a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes, I just don't, in general terms, when there's a march or a protest, rather than having snatch squads going in to arrest people, they often record and will arrest after the protest. I'm not sure if that was the case in the particular issue you referred to. I've met regularly with the last 2 weeks with Jewish groups, including earlier this week with the president of the Board of Deputies. But I'm more than happy to look into this particular case. It shouldn't be happening if that Jewish Londoners are feeling unsafe, even though police are there.
There are several instances, to be honest, and I'm quite happy to forward this on to you because it is of concern. But I think speaking to many Jewish colleagues in Harrow, etc., they're concerned that they're told that it's being looked into, but there's no information coming through on arrests. Do you have details of how many arrests have been made, etc., that you could make available to us so that we can show the Jewish community that it is being taken seriously?
Yeah.
And it is because when they see these events on television, they're seeing and they're getting reports back that police are just standing back. And clearly one of the issues that in very many demonstrations, police have actually got involved with some of demonstrations. But with this, they're standing back while massively vile language is used against Jewish people. And the Jewish community is very, very frightened, I can assure you, in London. And we really do have to do something to rest their minds. Now, if it's by giving them information about arrests that have been made, if it's comments coming from you saying this is totally unacceptable. I accept you always say all racism is unacceptable, and there isn't one person, I would say, in this chamber that disagrees with that. We all do. But we have got a very, very frightened Jewish community at the moment, and it is our responsibility, in my view, to do everything we can to make them feel that this is being dealt with appropriately.
Well, Chair, to say that the Prime Minister shares my views, and the Prime Minister as well, and the Home Secretary have met with Jewish groups to make sure they feel safe, and as indeed I have. And yesterday, most recently, the Deputy Mayors for Police and Crime and Communities met again with Jewish Londoners. But we've got to understand the fear they feel. I think Susan Hall is spot on in relation to the experience I've had speaking to Jewish Londoners about how frightened they feel. And there's events happening 3,000 miles away that's leading to anti-Semitism in our city, and it's not on. And I'm more than happy to provide the information that we've got in relation to the massive increase. The bad news is it's happening across our country. Manchester is another example where it's been happening. Obviously, we're in charge of London, but I just want to say, I'm afraid, it's even worse than you think, because it's not just in London. It's happening across our country. And also, speaking to colleagues in America, the Mayor of New York has talked about the issues there as well, and that's why it's really important, and you're spot on again. We've got to make sure we say loudly and clearly anti-Semitism is never acceptable, and in London we won't stand for it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
Assembly Member Rogers.
Bring the question of keeping Londoners safe perhaps to a more local level. Many of my constituents in Richmond are at present deeply worried about crime in the community. Tragically, as I'm sure you're aware, last week there was a murder in central Richmond in broad daylight. And this has compounded residents' existing concerns after some very serious antisocial behaviour incidents around Richmond Green and the Riverside following the previous lockdown easing last summer. So given these, I think, entirely justifiable, entirely understandable concerns, and given the previous decision to close Richmond Police Station, will you now commit to finding an alternative, permanent town centre base for the local Richmond Safer Neighbourhood teams?
Well, firstly, can I congratulate you on your election. I'm sure your predecessor has lots of advice for you, built up over many, many decades, about doing the job that you are now doing. Look, as I said in answer to a question from Caroline Russell, we're working on the new police and crime plan. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge that we faced over the last 5 years, we've lost from the Met Police Service budget already £850 million over the last 10 years. And so the choice often boils down to police officers or buildings and paying the rent and costs of a building. And so we're keen to make sure we can have as many frontline officers as we can, whilst recognising that actually the police need to have a presence in their respective communities. Sometimes these presences doesn't need to be a public-facing station where people can go and report crime, because most Londoners now report crime other ways rather than in person. But that it does need to be a physical presence in boroughs, not least because the time it takes to travel from a hub somewhere else is not time going to be spent wasted when have police officers in the community as much as possible. But I'm more than happy to get my team to look into the particular case you referred to. I'm not on top of the detail about that particular example you referred to, but with your permission, if I could get back to you about the example you gave in your community, I'm more than happy to do so.
Thank you, I'd appreciate that. And also, will you commit to meeting local councillors and residents so they can share their concerns with you?
Chair, during the course of Mayor's Question Time, I suspect my Diary Secretary had a heart attack in relation to the number of meetings I've committed to. If my meeting with the team you referred to can't happen soon, I'm more than happy for the Deputy Mayor to do it. I'm happy to do it, but it may be a long way after it's me. And if you want a quicker meeting, I'm more than happy to delegate to the Deputy Mayor, but I'm more than happy, Chair, to meet with you and members of your community. Of course I am.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Assembly Member Duval.
Chair. You early on alluded to about the issues of police financing police officers rather than buildings, because they're the choices that we have. You have rightly said earlier on that you have funded both policing enforcement action as well as crime preventative actions. Look, is there a structural problem in police funding around this and safety of Londoners? So if we go back to 2010, where the last austerity cuts on policing was, and then we roll forward to the grants that we're receiving from central government, the international grants, capital city grants, it roughly equates to the 800 million in terms of funding that we're adrift from. Is there a case for still making the arguments to government for fairer funding because they've been independently assessed? They've had third eyes look over them and said actually what London needs in both those grant issues, that's what you need to put. And if you got that money, where would be your priorities? Where would you put that money if you got that 800 million, which I think does belong to Londoners, which I think should be part of the fairer funding that we should be asking from central government?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the government accepts that the funding formula around policing is broken. And for a number of years now, they've wanted a new funding formula for the police. The problem is that's been delayed year after year. So the conversation first began 4 years ago about a new funding formula for the police, number one. Number two, historically, around 80% of the funding for the police comes from central government, 20% from council tax precept. Because of the massive cuts from central government, because we aren't receiving a fair share of national international cities grant money, a greater proportion is funded by City Hall, opposed by some members of the Assembly. But now it's 70-30 rather than 80-20. It would have been even worse cuts had we not filled the massive hole left by government. But you're right, the hole is too big for us to fill with council tax precept. And that's why we need either to receive the fair share of money we should receive as a capital city, and or for the funding formula to change. And otherwise, we're going to continue to have conversations about making tough choices about prioritising some crimes over others. There's a triage taking place, or prioritising buildings over police officers. Also, we get something like, I think something like £3 million for capital expenditure. That doesn't pay for our body-worn videos, let alone police vehicles and so forth. So the government does need to realise that the police funding formula is broken.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member. The next question is 1946, and that's Manifesto promises to black cab drivers, and the question is asked by Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. My manifesto set out my determination to continue to work with both the black cab trade and the private hire industry for the good of London. I know my Deputy Mayor for Transport and the TfL Commission will be meeting again with representatives from the trade soon, demonstrating the importance we place on these relationships. Taxis have a proud history in London. My transport strategy recognises the important role they continue to play in London, providing an accessible service for Londoners and visitors, and the special privileges for taxis that are referred to in the 2016 manifesto remain in place. Since 2016, I have led TfL to support taxi drivers, including through providing £30 million to support members of the taxi trade to de-license older, more polluting vehicles and support the uptake of greener, zero-emission capable taxis more than any previous mayor, creating more than 150 additional taxi ranks, more than any previous mayor, providing access to most bus lanes, more than any previous mayor, and establishing a taxi-dedicated rapid charge points and supporting plug-in taxi grants, more than any previous mayor. I know that many taxi drivers and their families have been personally affected by the pandemic, and tragically, some drivers have lost their lives. My thoughts remain with their families and friends. I'd like to thank all drivers for their tremendous efforts in supporting London's communities through the pandemic. I've heard stories of drivers offering free trips to our NHS staff, taking vulnerable Londoners to vaccination sites, delivering groceries and medication, and much more. The pandemic has been tough on the industry, and we've done what we can to support them throughout. TfL has met at least fortnightly with industry representatives to understand the challenges they face and identify ways to help. TfL has handed out free face masks to drivers and created a video to reassure the public that taxis can be safely used. They've licensed vehicles for a further period of 6 months when vehicle inspections were not available, and they've sought and relayed advice from the London Scientific Advisory Cell on the safe operation of services. I agree the industry needs more direct financial support, and I've written to the Chancellor to draw his attention to the plight of drivers in the capital, in particular to ensure they can access existing income support programmes. My support for the industry has in no way declined, and I see taxis playing a pivotal role in London's recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, was it an oversight then not to put that in your manifesto?
Sorry, that's for what?
The fact that they would have special privileges and that you'll maintain those special privileges?
I think I already answered that in my question. I can repeat it again if you didn't hear me.
No, I'm just asking you, was it an oversight then?
No, it wasn't. Shall I read back what I said?
No, I heard
Fine.
exactly
You
what
sure?
you said.
I don't mind.
No, I know you don't, but I do. So, you said that you're doing all you can to help the trade, and I accept that you are doing something to help the trade, but some of the changes you have made have been quite onerous on the trade, especially the older drivers and those with the older taxis. Would you, in light of the COVID pandemic and the damage that's done to the trade, would you, in light of that, consider reversing your rule to reduce the older taxis' lifespan to 12 years? Would you give that some consideration, Mr. Mayor? It won't make a lot of difference, and it would make a big difference to those people who have been struggling over the last year and a bit. And equally, you've said you've given more access to bus lanes, but in fact, you have actually cut down some of the routes that they traditionally used, much to the detriment of disabled people. Would you, again, consider making it a rule that taxis go where buses go?
So let me do with the number of points you raised in your question. It is a fact that unless we address the issue of NOx emissions coming from taxis, we aren't going to reduce the NOx emissions to levels that we're required to do by law. And so by me giving a greater financial support to the taxis to de-license, but also to have the cleaner, zero emissions capable vehicles, record sums, never given before, we will be able to meet the 2025 legal requirements to reduce NOx emissions from taxis by 65% compared to the 2013 level. So to do as you suggest would mean one health crisis being replaced by another one, which we can't afford to do. So we're going to continue our generous support to the taxi sector there. In relation to the bus lanes, even you have to accept us allowing taxis to use bus lanes that are now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is a big boon for taxis, because they can use these bus lanes when they otherwise won't be able to do so. I think almost 100% of bus lanes in London are able to be used by taxis, which means they can accelerate through congestion they'd otherwise have and avoid the challenges they otherwise have. And even you would have to accept, and I can repeat it again if you didn't hear me, the progress made in the last 5 years with some of the changes we've made to support taxis, from the rapid charging points, reserved for taxis almost 100 now. We've got more rapid charging points than any city in Western Europe, but also the support we're giving to the taxi industry. That being said, I accept fully the challenges they faced. In the 80s, before I became mayor, the numbers of PHVs went up from 60,000 to 120,000, and I appreciate the challenge that's brought on them. I appreciate those PHV drivers don't do the knowledge like black cab drivers do. So we've done what we can within the resources you have to support the black cab trade.
Yeah, I don't think that the black cab trade would share your confidence in that you've done what you can, I regret to say. I think you just said that taxis have access to 100% of bus lanes?
I said almost.
Oh, almost, yes, so that isn't 100% then, is it? And that is part of the problem, that some of the very strategic routes that they need to use to get disabled people to hospitals are now blocked to them, and that's something that, you know, I would urge you, Mr Mayor, to think again on, especially seeing as you lost a court case on that very point. In relation to charging points, yes, you have made some progress, although it be slow. Again, there are issues with PHV vehicles sitting on those charging points. Can you give some assurance that there'll be better enforcement of that?
Well, Chair, it would help me if the member could list, other than Bishopsgate, all the street space schemes that black cabs can't use.
Well, I can't list them now, but I'll write to you, Mr Mayor. I'll write to you.
I thought there were loads.
Well, then if you can also
there are dozens,
list
I thought,
to me the charging points that are not being blocked.
So let's accept after this exchange, the only street space scheme they can't use is Bishopsgate. A short period, a short length of Bishopsgate. Do we agree that?
Which then results in a 30-minute...
Do we agree that?
No, which then results in a 30-minute detour for those black cab drivers with disabled people going from Liverpool Street to St Thomas's Hospital. That's not being considerate, Mr Mayor. And if it's only one, then why can't you change it? Why do you have to insist on having this one? Is it some kind of virtual signalling for you? What is it?
So we've agreed now there are hundreds of street space schemes in our city, and part of one can't be used by black cabs. We've agreed that now.
No, we haven't actually, because we can start talking about local traffic neighbourhoods, if you like. We can talk about the ones in Redbridge, we can talk about the ones in Lewisham, we can talk about the ones in other boroughs, where access to cabs has now been denied. And again, disabled people are being unfairly disadvantaged by having those.
So can I just check, Chair, because it's really important for this discussion, is the assertion from the member that the Mayor should be in charge of borough roads?
No, the assertion from the member, Mr Mayor, is that you finance, the GLA authorise and finance the LTNs, and you run the bus lanes, Mr
Chair,
Mayor.
that's
We're
not
talking
correct,
about access for cabs, which is in your remit.
Can I just remind the Mayor, it's the Mayor's question time. It's not for you to ask questions of members. It's for members to ask questions of you. So carry on.
I would have hoped, Chair, that
Mr Mayor,
you'd want to correct an assertion that was false.
All I'm going to say, Mr Mayor, is that I wanted to give you the opportunity, because we had a very nice opening, and perhaps I didn't, and I should have congratulated you on your re-election, as many have done. But I wanted to give you the opportunity, Mr Mayor, to try and help a trade that is in desperate measures at the moment. They've not been able to work. They still can't work, a lot of them. There's not the footfall in central London, which they're reliant on, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity, Mr Mayor, to make a few minor adjustments so that you could help the trade. Clearly, you don't want to do that, and I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Will the Assembly, I've got to ask at this point, will the Assembly agree to the suspension of Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h in order to allow the remaining business on the agenda to be completed? Nobody against that. It's funny, when I was sitting down there, I always used to be against that, but never mind. Thank you. If we can now move on to the next question, it's question 2185. It's the congestion charge in the name of Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. The government required me to urgently bring forward proposals to change the level and scope of the congestion charge as a condition of the first emergency TfL funding agreement in May, when government support was urgently needed because of the impact of the pandemic on TfL's finances. In October, TfL's second funding deal from government required us to keep in place the current temporary changes to the congestion charge as a continuing response to the pandemic. This condition was rolled over into the two subsequent extensions to the funding deal. The temporary changes have been designed to discourage unnecessary car journeys and make it easier for people who need to travel in central London to do so. This supports wider temporary changes to the transport network to enable more people to walk and cycle while public transport capacity is constrained by social distancing requirements. TfL is working faster than ever before to deliver safe, segregated cycle routes, to provide more space for pedestrians, and to enable the bus network to run as efficiently and smoothly as possible. TfL's 2021-2022 budget does assume, for planning purposes only, that the temporary changes to the congestion charge are retained on the basis that they will still be required as an emergency response to the transport challenges arising from the pandemic, and we're not currently able to predict when this will change. TfL is keeping the temporary changes under constant review, especially as we move through the government's roadmap for easing restrictions. Ultimately, as I've said many times, a long-term funding deal for TfL is essential for London and for the national economy. I've been clear that I'll keep fighting for what's best for Londoners in negotiations with the government, and that includes what the optimal congestion charging arrangements are to support London's economic recovery, ensuring it's a green and sustainable one.
Mr. Mayor, that's not actually what you told LBC about a week or so before the election. My highlight of the entire election campaign was when you U-turned on this policy and you said you wanted to go back to what it was before, i.e. 5 days a week and weekdays. So, to be clear, are you now saying that you will be pushing, as your commitment on the LBC interview, that you will be going back to what the congestion charge was before?
I'm quite clear. The only reason that people are paying congestion charge 7 days a week at £15 up to 10 p.m. is because the government attached as a condition to the funding deal those terms. I want us to be back in charge of what the congestion charge should be. That autonomy means we could decide what works for our city rather than either the Secretary of State, a number 10 advisor, or civil servants in Whitehall or the DfT. We should be deciding what the C charge would be, and you'll be aware by record, before the government intervened, we kept £11.50, we kept it till the times we had before, 5 days a week. The record of my mayoralty is not increasing it to £15 a week unless forced to do so by the government, or 7 days a week, or till 10 p.m. I think Londoners want me in charge of setting the level rather than the government.
So when are you going to reduce it back to when it was?
Well, we're currently speaking to the government about the next funding deal. As I said in answer to the previous question, it's probably not sensible for me to give a running commentary on the deal with the government should we reach one. The key thing is for the government to recognise in the short term we all need support from the government, particularly with the fares revenues not being anywhere near what it was before the pandemic. In the medium to long term, we will need to make sure TfL is on a sustainable financial footing, and I think it's important for us to work together, government and TfL, to make sure we get a good deal for TfL, which is a good deal for London, which is then a good deal for the country.
And will you, when you make that change, I hope you will make the change, you did promise to on LBC, will you also reintroduce the residents' discount, please?
Well, listen, all these things are some of the things we're discussing with the government. If you have any influence over either grant chaps, the government, a number 10 advisor, or even the Prime Minister, now's the time to use it.
Well, you're the Mayor of London, Mr. Mayor, and as you have got a mandate, I'm hoping you'll do what you said a week or so before the election, because LBC listeners will be listening. I'll leave it there, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to hand the chair over to Assembly Member Prince to enable me to ask a supplementary.
So, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'd like to call on Assemblymember Boff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We both attended the opening of the Blossom Garden, which was there, and it was absolutely brilliant, I must say. And I was really moved by the commitment of the staff who had been invited towards fighting the pandemic. After the event, I went and talked to those staff, and I said, if you know, now I'm chair of the London Assembly, I said, what question would you ask? And the question that those NHS workers asked, many of whom were London ambulance drivers, they said, what effect, they asked me to raise to you the issue for them of the increased costs that they are going to face as a result of the expanded ULEZ and the congestion charge. And they wanted you to take that on board and consider that. Much concern was expressed by those NHS staff about the retention of staff in London when the competition for health service workers is very, very keen. And they're saying that it's very difficult to retain staff in London as a result of these new onerous costs of both the ULEZ extension and the congestion charge. And really it's about, that's what it is.
Chair, can I just check, in the conversations, is that because these staff own vehicles that are older than 2005?
Well, what happens, it may very well be, but what it is when a shift, for example, starts at an ambulance station at 4 a.m., there is no practical public transport alternative for them to get into work. And so if they're doing 5 days a week at that time, they're paying 5 times the ULEZ. I didn't want to make this a political point, but it's merely because I was there and I did say, if you wanted to ask the Mayor of London a question, what would it be? And this was voluntary on their part.
So regrettably, Mr. Mayor, we've run out of time.
You can write.
We can talk about it.
Thank you very much.
I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for the indulgence, Assembly. I realise it's awkward at that time. Thank you. The next question is in the name of Assembly Member Duval, and it's the Green New Deal and Green New Jobs.
Thank you, Chair. My Green New Deal aims to double the size of London's green economy by 2030 through retrofitting buildings, renewable energy, electric vehicle charging and urban greening. London's green sector has a strong track record of economic growth, doubling in size over the last decade, creating 150,000 jobs. Increasing levels of investment and ambition both in London and nationally will create conditions for all businesses to grow back stronger, and the green sector will be at the heart of this. Analysis from IPPR estimates that investing in a green recovery could create 1.6 million green jobs in the UK over 10 years. In London, meeting our retrofit challenge alone could support an estimated 140,000 jobs. I'm redoubling efforts to support investment in London's environment. My Green New Deal fund is already investing £10 million in programmes that support around 1,000 green jobs while tackling the climate emergency and inequalities. And I've set aside £20 million in both this year and next year to support the Green New Deal. One of our New Schools academies will focus specifically on green jobs. But together we can achieve even more. As we approach COP26, I want to work with the government to increase the level of ambition at the national level, tackling the climate emergency while supporting jobs and a just transition.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we get the idea of a Green New Deal where there are jobs at every level and every sector of the economy. And we get that. But in terms of the green infrastructure and some of the thinking around that, should we not be persuading our colleagues in local government to think about a single waste authority in terms of trying to restructure some of the issues around recycling and part of delivering some extra jobs that may come of it? I was taken very much by the earlier intervention by the Assembly member earlier on, but I always remember it was taken by a waste authority, was the first proposer of that incinerator. Is there some better thinking we can get around some of these recycling schemes that have a better production around those issues and more economic as well as creating jobs?
I think the short answer is yes. The more diplomatic answer, as somebody who was a councillor and you as somebody who was a former leader, it's a lot of effort to get 32 boroughs and the City of London in the same place. You'll be aware of the... we've got to be careful that we don't take powers away from councils and stuff, and so it's a challenge that we should look towards doing, because you're spot on. If we're going to properly address the issue of increasing recycling, reducing incinerator use, address the issue of climate change and air quality, the current furniture doesn't work in relation to local government. Now, it's not me wanting to have a bigger slice of their pie, but it's quite...
I'd be more than happy if our colleagues in local government took it on board themselves and run it themselves and working in partnership with ourselves. I wouldn't want to do a power grab around that, but I think there has to be a debate along those lines around some of that green infrastructure where they need to take those decisions.
Yeah.
And there will be other issues where we can come to help and support. We don't need to. We can influence. We don't need to run it ourselves as a single waste authority, but they need to take the steps if they are serious about the new Green Deal. And I think it's a positive step forward about that. I remember colleagues of the Assembly Group in the, if I can mention, the Brian Coleman many years ago, who was totally against this and then came round to supporting it partly because of the arguments of what it meant at that particular time. It's now an imperative that issues like that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
We have got the time to do it. It very much goes along with a colleague of working towards the next 9 years, but it seems essential in terms of our economic recovery that we start to raise these debates.
No, there is some good news, Len, which is you are getting geographical partnerships between councils in some parts of London. You know, so you are getting some of this happening almost by osmosis rather than by somebody saying, you know what, shouldn't we just... And so, more than happy to have the discussion. What I wouldn't want is a bun fight.
Yeah, I agree. We haven't got time for that. We need to actually just focus on the evidence and see where people are going. Can I just move on very quickly to about training needs that we've identified around London's green economy, but also in particularly about training needs that there seems to be that London has always been a centre of, at different levels, whether it's at colleges of FE but also universities, that are doing the research, that are training the next generation of people to take some of these jobs on. Is that an ambition of yours that London should be part of that centre, and should that be shared by government? And then take it nationally across all the university sectors and training providers at different levels. Where does that fit in terms of some of that plan? I've read some of the Green New Deal. I get some of it, but is it? Are you committed to that? Is that where you want to take it? And with those partners, I know you're not in control of the sector completely. We've got one aspect of where we can seriously influence it, but where are we going to try and drag the others into this debate of where we should be, and particularly about where London should position that university sector and that other training providers sector?
Absolutely, that's our ambition. It's got to be our ambition. And in the last 5 years, our reputation around the world has grown hugely in this area. The numbers of green jobs in the small, medium and big companies is going in the right direction. And people are excited to start a business in London or expand it, and also to provide funding. The number of angel investors who want to come here is fantastic. We're also working with the private sector around finance, around green infrastructure. The key thing, though, is to make sure that Londoners benefit from the jobs and monies that have been generated here. And that's why the Academy's work is so important. If we're honest, there have been examples in the past where we've been world leaders in sectors where Londoners haven't benefited from the fruits of that. And this is a really good opportunity for us to plan now to make sure we have the expertise for the jobs going forward, from retrofitting, as was raised in answer to the previous question. Retrofitting is the game changer for reducing carbon emissions, because we can, and it creates jobs as well. High-skilled, well-paid jobs going forward. That's one part of the equation. What about carbon capture? What about making sure that we can have things like Fin and tech working together going forward? And there's so many things we can be doing. Good news is a lot of new startups in London are already doing this, and we think we can support them to, you know, not just be an incubator, but to be an accelerator and export their skills overseas. Our future over the next century has got to be in future-proof jobs, and green's one of them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Duval. The next question is question 1881, the Queen's Speech. Assemblymember Sheikh.
Okay. Congratulate you on your election. It was lovely to meet your mum a couple of weeks ago, and she's incredibly proud of you, I know, and it's good to be campaigning with, it was good campaigning with you, and it's good to have you now as a colleague on the Assembly. We've yet to see the detail, Chair, of the bills announced in the Queen's Speech, but I'll carefully consider their potential impact on London and Londoners when they're published. Important bills in the environment and on policing crime, sentencing and courts were both carried over, and we'll engage with the Government and Parliament as they progress in this new session. We'll also study carefully the detail and implications of the Planning Bill, the Building Safety Bill and other bills when published. The Government's legislative programme also included a commitment to refresh its draft Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. I'm keen to work with the Government to ensure its strategy reflects the needs of victims and survivors in London. The Queen's Speech included a commitment to a Levelling Up white paper due later this year. I want to work with the 9 metro mayors and government on this to level up all of our regions for the benefit of the whole national economy. Our local economies, cities and regions don't exist in isolation. We're bound together more than ever by supply chains and social and commercial ties. Last week, I went to North Yorkshire, where I met newly elected Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin, and saw firsthand the state-of-the-art electric buses that have been manufactured there for Transport for London. Our recovery from this pandemic is too important to let politics get in the way, so I'm also reaching out to the government so we can work constructively together for the sake of London and the whole country.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your warm congratulations, and my warm congratulations to you also. I was hoping we could focus in a little bit more on some of the aspects around the planning bill that were spoken about in the Queen's speech. One of the things that I believe are quite worrying and laid out in the white paper last year are the potential risks of undermining local democracy by removing decision-making and making the planning system less accountable to the people who live in that community. So my question to you is, what will you do to ensure communities and local councils are at the heart of any incoming planning reforms?
You raise a really important question, and actually that one of the most important things councils do and we do is in relation to planning and making sure that we can provide a strategic input to decisions made locally, particularly for the bigger schemes as well. Some people are caricaturing the government's plans as quote-unquote a developer's charter. And I think, I'm not saying all developers are bad, and all developments are bad, but if you take out of the equation local input, it can lead to developments that are not good for the local community, don't respect the heritage, and don't invest in the long term. And I think we've got to watch out for that going forward. I'm also concerned about more and more so-called permitted development, because permitted development is a way of going around all the safeguards that you have in place in relation to design, quality, the type of housing, the type of development, community gain, and so forth. A lot of the community gain is around Section 106s, around infrastructure levy, and so forth. And so we've got to watch out for these things. And the final thing I'd say in answer to your really important question is, we've got to be careful we don't make permanent physical change based upon a temporary pandemic. And so the West End is a good example. I'm not in favour of some of those buildings on Oxford Street, for example, to be turned from retail to residential. There is a place for residential in the centre of London. I think we've got to be a bit careful, though, about developers centrally or civil service in Whitehall taking the decisions out of local politicians' hands.
Thank you for that answer, and I agree with you, retail to residential could be dangerous for the recovery of our high streets, and I look forward to working with you over the next 3 years to ensure that doesn't happen. I also wanted to focus in on another aspect that I think could be quite worrying in the incoming planning bill, and that's around the impact it could have on environmental assessments. Now, the Town and County Planning Association have already said that we need to strengthen our environmental credentials for the planning law and focus it on cutting emissions, carbon emissions specifically. Now, how can we help shape a planning system fit for London's future that puts environmental quality at its heart and allows us to build the green homes our capital needs?
Well, it's good news, and the good news is that our London plan, and it goes to the reputation we have in answer to the question that Len asked, is world leading. We require new homes to be net zero carbon, but also we require non-domestic developments to be net zero. And that makes us world leading, but also leads to innovation, not just in London, but around the country to meet the requirement we have in our London plan. We've got to be careful, though, that the government's planning changes doesn't dilute some of the high standards we have in London. And by the way, the private sector love it because we give them certainty. They can plan for the innovation, the investment, and so forth. And so we've got to be a bit careful. And I'm sure the government wouldn't do this intentionally, but the government doesn't inadvertently, by weakening some of the local input, dilute some of the planning laws we have in place. And the other point to make is, I think we should be having ambitious emission targets. We have to. And that's why we've now gone from having a plan to be zero carbon by 2050 to zero carbon by 2030. That provides both opportunities but challenges as well. I'm hoping there are more opportunities than challenges.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And the last question is question 1873, the health of Londoners, being asked by Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Londoners have worked hard to help bring the number of cases down, but we must remember that the battle against the virus is not over. As the city reopens, I'll continue to support Londoners to stay safe. One of my first priorities in my second term is continued support for vaccine efforts across the city. It's the only way we're going to beat this virus and avoid more restrictions. Working with our partners and communities, we must ensure that all Londoners feel confident to take up the vaccine when it's their turn. And I want to thank you, Dr. Sahota, for the work you're doing in relation to dealing with hesitancy. As we overcome the virus itself, building a society where our mental health and well-being is properly prioritised funded and protected has to be key to recovering from this pandemic. Mental health is a priority in our recovery programme, and I'll be invested in community-led programmes to reduce social isolation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and congratulations on your re-election. The vaccination rates are, we've done a good job of vaccinations. Of course, London hasn't done as well as the rest of the country, but that's been to the hard work of the NHS staff who've been delivering the vaccination. What the government can take credit for was well laid out yesterday in the House of Commons by Dominic Cunningham, and what they can take credit for in the response to the COVID-19. But I am really concerned about one thing, that the 5 boroughs you highlighted, Hillingdon, Brent, Harrow, Ealing and Hounslow, is where the Indian virus variant is rising. It happens to be on the doorstep of Heathrow Airport, which brings into question our policy on test, trace, isolation and quarantine. Are you reassured that we've got the quarantine measures put in place and they're being properly administered to protect Londoners?
You raise a really important question, and there's a long answer and a short answer. Because of time, I'll give you the short answer, which is those northwest boroughs are a concern for a number of reasons. We're a global city. Heathrow is the world's busiest airport. And as you mentioned, Hillingdon, Harrow, Hounslow, but also Ealing and Brent, we've been concerned for some time, not just because of Heathrow, but the vast majority of quarantine hotels are in Hounslow. And many people arriving from countries where we're concerned come to Hillingdon and stay in Hounslow. We've been checking to make sure that there's proper, robust enforcement. We've been checking to make sure those staff who work in these hotels and places, even though they're younger than 30, are receiving the vaccine. A number of things happening. The good news is, even though those 5 boroughs are separate boroughs, they're working really closely together, the chief execs and the council leaders. Good support from PHE and from the NHS and from councils across London and of course City Hall and the government. And so we need to try and make sure we don't have this virus spreading. The game changer is the success of the vaccine against the variant first found in India, but also test trace is finally working, and the government has given, and I welcome this and thank them for this, additional financial support to those boroughs in relation to self-isolation support systems, but also in test trace. It is working, it appears. Everybody who arrives in London and does a PCR test, it's tech for genomic sequencing to see if they've got the Indian variant. And I think we've now got, as a consequence of our team working over across London, really good relations pan-London. But also, I've got to give credit to Nadeem Zahawi. He's been a fantastic minister. I spoke to him this week. You know, party politics does not matter. He listens to our concerns and takes steps to address them, and it's been a pleasure to work with him.
Great. That's reassuring, because of course the response has got to be from national government and local government collectively. Just one more thing. Of course, you will have reviewed or realised the impact of the COVID-19 and increasing the inequalities in London. Have you started to look at your health inequality strategy in light of the experiences of COVID-19 and what we can do to make adjustments to that strategy?
Yeah, really good question. So Professor Kevin Fenton, who is respected around the country and around the world, is leading this piece of work. He's going to be my statutory advisor. Dr. Coffey will carry on being my health advisor. Kevin is keen to see if we can...
Mr Mayor, would you excuse me for interrupting you? The Labour group is now out of time, so if you could bring your comments to an end. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Mayor, for answering those questions today. You're free to go.
Thanks,
thank you very
Chair.
much. In part B of the agenda, can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out in the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. Is that agreed? Thank you. Item 5 is the date of the next meeting. The next scheduled meeting of the London Assembly will be the plenary meeting, which will take place at 10 a.m. on Thursday, the 10th of June, in the chamber at City Hall. Finally, please be aware that an extraordinary meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee is due to begin shortly for those members who are members of that committee. Thank you very much for a actually not bad meeting. I'm sure it's going to go downhill from now on. Thank you very much.
Well done.